Elliot Carter had always been a man of routine. His mornings were spent in the quiet solitude of his study, where the only sound was the steady tapping of his old typewriter. It had been with him for years, an antique relic passed down from his father, a successful journalist who had once written about the darkest corners of the human experience. Elliot admired the old machine for its weight, its deliberate mechanics. Each key had a history, each letter a connection to the past. It was a tool of precision, one that he used to carve stories from the depths of his imagination. But that morning, as he sat down at the typewriter, the air in the room felt different. The silence was oppressive, the weight of it pressing against his chest. The typewriter seemed to hum, a faint vibration in the old wood, as if it had a life of its own. Elliot shrugged it off, attributing it to the remnants of the dream he had just woken from. It was always the same strange, unsettling dreams that he couldn't quite remember when he woke up, but they always left a lingering sense of dread, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He cracked his knuckles and began typing. He didn't know what the story would be about. It didn't matter. His fingers moved automatically, like they had a mind of their own, each keystroke flowing into the next. He often found that his best work came from these early moments of writing, when the words seemed to spill out, as though the story already existed, waiting for him to bring it to life. The sky was dark. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the old house. Elliot paused for a moment. The words felt right. The description was vivid, and the tension in the air seemed to resonate with something deep inside him. He went on, typing faster now, his mind racing to catch up with the rhythm of the machine. A man sat alone in the study, the only light coming from the flickering candle on the desk. His fingers hovered over the pages of a book he had been reading all night, but the words were fading from his memory, like smoke in the air. The tapping of the keys quickened, almost frantic. His fingers didn't feel like his own anymore, but he couldn't stop. It was as if the story was being dictated to him, an invisible force pulling the words from his fingers. His breathing became shallow, and a bead of sweat formed on his brow. He heard a noise from above, the sound of something moving, something breathing. He knew he was alone. He had to be. Elliot's hands shook as he typed the last sentence. He wiped his brow, the sweat now dripping down his face. The room felt colder. The air was thicker. The words on the page glowed faintly, the ink shimmering in a way he had never seen before. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of what he had just written sinking in. It was strange, unsettling, and yet there was something familiar about it. He looked up at the ceiling. The hum of the typewriter seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the room. The silence was deafening. "Who's there?" Elliot whispered. The air grew colder still. His eyes darted around the room, but everything appeared normal. Nothing had changed. Nothing except the weight in the air, the palpable tension. Something was off. Something was wrong. That evening, after a dinner alone in his sparse kitchen, Elliot returned to his study, convinced the unease from earlier was merely a product of his overactive mind. He set to work editing his manuscript, the words he had typed earlier feeling almost alien to him. It was a simple story, a man in an old house, a creeping dread, but it had somehow become more than just fiction. The emotions were too raw, too close to something he had felt before. Elliot's fingers hovered over the typewriter again, a sense of unease washing over him as he stared at the blank page before him. The rhythmic tapping of the keys had a hypnotic effect, lulling him into a trance. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the empty space. He hadn't written anything for the past 20 minutes, and the silence in the room felt oppressive. Then, without warning, his fingers began typing again, on their own. The man in the study was no longer alone. He could feel the presence behind him, lurking in the shadows. Elliot jumped back, his heart racing in his chest. He hadn't typed that. He hadn't even thought about it. But the words were there, appearing on the page as if someone, or something, had taken control of his hands. The room was cold now. The familiar hum of the typewriter sounded too loud in the stillness. He glanced over his shoulder, his neck stiff with tension. Nothing. He looked back at the paper. The words continued to flow, each sentence more unsettling than the last. The man turned around slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. In the corner of the room stood a figure, barely visible, its face obscured by shadows. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This wasn't just a story anymore. The words on the page were too vivid, too real. It was as though the story was writing itself, feeding on his fear, drawing him deeper into the nightmare. He reached for the typewriter, his hands trembling, but before he could stop himself, the words appeared. The figure in the corner moved closer, its breath cold against the man's neck. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. The words didn't stop. They kept coming, as if the typewriter had a mind of its own, dictating the story to him in real time. He tried to pull his hands away, but they wouldn't move. His fingers were locked on the keys, typing faster now, uncontrollable. "I see you," the figure whispered. Elliot couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, as if something was choking him. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, and the faint sound of breathing filled the air again. It was coming from above. From the ceiling. Just like in the story. "Who's there?" Elliot typed, his fingers moving of their own accord. The typewriter rattled, its keys clattering louder and faster now, as if something was trying to break free from the page. "You know me," the figure's voice said. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the typewriter fell silent. The room went still. The words on the page stared back at him, waiting. Elliot's pulse raced. He wasn't sure what was happening anymore. His mind was spinning, his thoughts a whirlpool of confusion. Had the story been predicting his every move? Had it been writing itself all along? Or had he been writing it and not even known it? Elliot's hands were shaking as he reached for the page. He had to know. He had to see what had happened. He ripped the sheet from the typewriter, his breath shallow as he stared at the words. The page was blank. No. He flipped it over. The words he had written earlier, the sentences that had terrified him so much, were gone. There was nothing. Just the emptiness of the paper, the absence of any mark at all. Panic began to claw at him, the tightness in his chest constricting. He could hear the breath again, slow and deliberate, coming from above, coming from everywhere. His fingers clutched the edges of the paper, his mind racing. What had happened? And then, as if to answer his question, a sound came from the doorway, faint at first, but unmistakable. A figure stepped into the room. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the figure. It was him. Elliot's heart slammed against his ribcage as he stared at the figure standing in the doorway. The man was tall, wearing a dark, rumpled coat. His hair was disheveled, his eyes locked onto Elliot's with an eerie intensity. But what caught Elliot's attention the most was how familiar the man looked, almost too familiar. The figure stood motionless, the quiet hum of the apartment the only sound between them. Elliot's breath hitched as his mind raced to make sense of the situation. The man looked like him. Exactly like him. Same sharp features, same unshaven jaw, same dark circles under his eyes. But this wasn't just a man who resembled him. This was Elliot, standing there, in the doorway, staring back at him. A chill ran down Elliot's spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure didn't move. Didn't blink. His eyes were fixated on Elliot, as though studying him, measuring him. Finally, Elliot's trembling hand reached for the lamp on the desk, flipping the switch in desperation, but the light flickered, barely illuminating the room. In that dim glow, the man seemed to shimmer, as though he was almost translucent. "Who are you?" Elliot's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The figure stepped forward, his face tight with a knowing expression. "I'm you." Elliot took a step back, his pulse racing. "That's impossible." His voice was strained, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "You can't be." "I am you," the figure interrupted, his voice low, a haunting whisper that seemed to penetrate deep into Elliot's mind. The figure's lips didn't even move as he spoke, yet the words filled the room with an unnerving finality. "I came from the book." Elliot blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "The book? What do you mean?" "The book that writes itself." The figure's eyes darkened. "You're the one who opened it." A sense of vertigo gripped Elliot. His knees weakened, and he leaned heavily against the desk to steady himself. The room around him seemed to sway, the edges of his vision blurring, as though reality itself was folding in on itself. It couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. It was madness. "No," Elliot whispered. "No, I don't believe you. This is some kind of hallucination. Some trick my mind is playing on me." The figure smiled, a small, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't escape it. You wrote it into existence. You created this." The words settled into Elliot's chest like a stone, the weight of them pressing against his ribs. He looked down at the typewriter, still sitting on the desk, the empty page staring back at him. It was as if the air itself was suffocating him, the heaviness of the silence wrapping itself around his neck. I didn't mean to," his words faltered, his mind spinning as he tried to rationalize what was happening. But he couldn't. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing fit. The figure took another step forward, and this time, Elliot didn't move. He couldn't. He was trapped. The man's voice was barely a whisper as he leaned in close. "You can't undo it. Not now. The story has already been written. It's too late." Elliot's mind reeled, the implications of what the figure was saying slowly sinking in. The book. The words. He had been writing them. But they weren't just words, they were more than that. They were reality, twisted and manipulated by his own hand. The figure stepped closer, his breath cold against Elliot's face. It was then that Elliot noticed something even more disturbing. The figure's eyes, which had once been like his own, now held a dark emptiness, an abyss where humanity once resided. They were hollow, black holes that stared back at him, and in that moment, Elliot realized something chilling. This man, this thing, wasn't really him at all. It was a creature born from the typewriter, from the very words he had written. The figure grinned, sensing Elliot's realization. You thought you could create whatever you wanted. A story that bends to your will. But that's the curse, isn't it? The words are never truly yours. You only write the beginning. But someone else writes the ending. The room seemed to shrink around Elliot, the walls pressing inward, the air growing thick with dread. He staggered backward, his eyes darting toward the typewriter. Could it be true? Had the words he typed somehow come to life? Had they taken on form, a life of their own? He had created the figure in the doorway. He had created him. Elliot's fingers twitched toward the typewriter, desperate to undo what had been done. But when his hand grazed the keys, a jolt of static electricity shot through his fingers, making him pull back in shock. The typewriter rattled on the desk, the keys moving on their own. The figure was watching him intently, a knowing smile curling at the corners of its lips. You can try, it said, but it won't matter. You wrote the ending, and now it's coming for you. Elliot's heart raced. The words, they had come true. They weren't just fiction anymore. They were real. The figure, the shadow, it was real. And it had come to claim him. With his mind swimming in terror, Elliot ran his fingers over the keys again, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the words wouldn't stop. The story wouldn't stop. The figure stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing with malice. It had come to take what was owed. Elliot's chest tightened as the words appeared before his eyes. The figure had been right. The story had a life of its own. And it was writing its own ending now. The horror was unfolding in real time, shaping everything around him. Every word, every sentence, it all had consequences. The figure stepped closer, its breath hot on the man's neck, its shadow swallowing him whole. Elliot recoiled as the words wrote themselves, as if the story was being fed to him, drawn out of his very soul. He could feel the weight of the typewriter in his hands, the raw force of whatever force was controlling the machine, pulling at his will, shaping him like clay in the hands of a twisted god. He tried to stand up, to move away, but his body refused to obey him. His feet were glued to the floor, as if the very space around him was consuming him, erasing his will to escape. He could feel the presence behind him, just inches away. He could feel the cold, malefic energy emanating from the figure, his creation. There is no escape, the words wrote themselves again, appearing on the page before his eyes. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His throat was paralyzed, his body trembling in fear. How could he have been so blind? How could he have not realized the power he had unleashed? The figure moved closer, the space between them shrinking until there was no distance left. The air was cold and stagnant, suffocating him. The typewriter rattled, the keys clattering under the invisible force guiding it. And as the figure loomed over him, the final words began to appear, and Elliot knew then that there was no undoing it. The man typed the final words and sealed his fate. He was part of the story now, and the story would never let him go. Elliot closed his eyes, but the darkness that followed was suffocating. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and Elliot felt his body freeze in place. He was no longer the creator. He was the created. And with that, the typewriter fell silent. Elliot's breath was shallow, his chest heaving as the last remnants of his fear began to fade. For a brief moment, the world around him felt still. But then, reality began to bend once again. His eyes snapped open, the dim light of the room filtering in through the blinds. His fingers were still resting on the keys of the typewriter, and the faintest hum seemed to vibrate through his fingertips. Something was wrong. The air was colder than it should have been, and the shadows, those oppressive, ever-creeping shadows, seemed to twist unnaturally in the corners of the room. He could still hear the faint scratching of keys, even though the typewriter had fallen silent just moments before. Slowly, his fingers moved again, against his will, and the typewriter began typing of its own accord. The man woke up in his own bed, disoriented, but nothing was as it seemed. Elliot stared at the words on the paper, his heart racing. This wasn't the story he had written. The room was unchanged. The walls still contained the same familiar cracks. But there was something terribly off about it. He couldn't quite place it, but everything had a surreal quality now, as if the boundaries between the real world and the world he had written about were beginning to dissolve. The figure, the one he had created, had it followed him into this reality? Elliot's head spun, trying to understand what had happened. He had typed the story. He had written it into existence. He had created the figure, the thing that had now come into his life. But how could it be real? How could the line between fiction and reality have blurred in such a horrific way? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard anyone come in. The apartment was still, the air thick with silence. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen anyone walk past his window. And yet, there was a knock, soft but insistent. The same feeling of dread settled into his stomach, as though something far worse than just the figure in the doorway was approaching. The weight of the world seemed to bear down on him, and he knew that whatever was coming was not going to be something he could escape. His legs felt stiff, as though they had been shackled to the floor. His mind screamed for him to move, to get up, to escape, but his body refused to obey. The knock came again. "Elliot," the voice whispered from the other side. "It's time." He recoiled, the words reverberating in his mind. He could feel the weight of the name, the sound of it calling to him. There was something so wrong about it, like it wasn't his name at all, but a sound meant to bind him. He had never heard the voice before, yet it felt like he had known it his whole life. His fingers twitched against the typewriter, and the sound of the keys echoed in the otherwise still room. As though under someone else's control, his hand reached forward and began typing. The knock came again. This time, it was louder, as if the figure knew that it had won. The sound of the knock on the door echoed louder, and with it, something more. The faint rustling of fabric. The scraping of metal on the floor. A low, guttural growl that filled the room, reverberating through the walls until Elliot's entire body vibrated with the weight of it. Elliot couldn't move. The words, his words, were coming to life around him, becoming the very fabric of his existence. The figure from the story, the one he had written, was stepping closer, and with each step, the room seemed to shift and warp. The boundaries between the world he had known and the nightmare he had written began to blur, and the air grew thicker, darker. He could feel it now, a presence, close to him, pressing against his chest, filling his lungs with a cold, suffocating air. He turned, slowly, hoping against hope that he was wrong, that this was some kind of mistake. But there it was. The figure. His own creation. Tall, thin, and towering above him, with eyes black as pits and a smile that stretched far too wide across its face. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The presence of it was enough. Elliot's body trembled as he stood frozen in the chair, unable to move, unable to breathe. "You wrote me," the figure's voice filled his head, sending a jolt of terror through his spine. "You created me, Elliot. And now you're mine." The typewriter rattled on the desk, the keys moving of their own accord as the figure's shadow stretched across the room. Elliot's fingers hovered above the keys, no longer in his control, but still forced to obey. His chest tightened as the words appeared on the page. The man tried to speak, but the words would not come. The figure towered over him, its hands outstretched, waiting for him to understand. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt hollow, as though his lungs had been ripped from his body, and yet his heart continued to beat, each pulse stronger, louder than the last. "You belong to me now," the figure whispered, its voice slithering through Elliot's thoughts, crawling deep into his soul. "You opened the door, and now you're part of the story. There's no escaping it. There's no undoing it." The walls of the room began to close in around him. The apartment was warping, shrinking, as though the very space was folding in on itself. The light from the typewriter cast long, grotesque shadows that danced on the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. The figure stepped closer, its long fingers reaching out toward him. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came. His breath came in short, frantic gasps as his heart hammered in his chest. The air grew heavier, suffocating him, and the darkness wrapped around him like a cocoon, slowly, deliberately. He was no longer in control of his own body, his own mind. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by the twisted words he had written. "You can't escape," the figure said again, its voice growing more urgent, more insistent. "You're part of the story now. And stories don't have endings. Not for you." The figure reached out and touched him, and in that moment, the world vanished. When Elliot opened his eyes again, he was back at the typewriter. His fingers rested on the keys, and the words were already there, waiting. His pulse thudded in his ears as he stared at the page in front of him. The man sat alone at his desk, his fingers moving on the keys, unable to stop typing. The words he wrote came to life, consuming everything around him. The sound of breathing was all around him. He could feel it in his chest, in his ears, in his bones. The presence was there again, hovering just out of sight. He wrote. And the story never ended. Elliot's fingers moved of their own accord, typing the words faster now, a frantic energy building inside him, pushing him to write, to complete the story, to find the end. But the end was gone. There was no escape. As the words formed, the room around him blurred again, the shadows stretching and writhing like living things, pulling him into the darkness. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't stop writing. The man's eyes were wide, staring into the blackness, and he realized, too late, that he was the story. He was the one who had never been able to escape. And in that moment, Elliot knew the truth. There was no end to this. Not for him. He had written it. And now, it would never stop. Elliot's eyes were locked onto the typewriter in front of him. His fingers moved without his consent, the keys clicking rhythmically beneath his trembling hands. The words were forming, one after the other, faster now, more insistent. He wanted to stop, to pull away from the machine, but it was as if the words were coming from deep inside him, a place he couldn't control. The man tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The story was writing itself. He could feel it. The story, the words, the typewriter, they were all consuming him, swallowing him whole. His body was no longer his own, just an extension of the horror he had created. And the worst part? He was aware of it. Every single moment, every single second, he could feel himself slipping deeper into the darkness, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. You can't fight it, the figure's voice echoed in his mind. You wrote it. You were part of it. Elliot couldn't think straight. The world around him seemed to twist and bend, the walls shrinking, the shadows creeping closer. The room felt alive, pulsing with a life of its own. The typewriter, the keys, even the words, they all seemed to feed off him, drawing him deeper into its grasp. The man's heart raced. He knew he was trapped. And the more he tried to escape, the tighter the story's grip became. Elliot's fingers were locked in place, the keys clattering faster now, faster than he could even process. The figure's presence loomed over him, a dark shadow at the edge of his vision, watching, waiting. Elliot could feel its eyes on him, those hollow, black eyes that burned into his soul. "I'll never let you go," the figure whispered. "You wrote me. You can't undo it. This is who you are now. This is your fate." Tears streamed down Elliot's face, but he couldn't stop writing. The words, his words, poured out of him like a flood. Every line, every sentence was more suffocating than the last. He was no longer just writing a story, he was writing his own doom. The man's mind fractured, splintered by the weight of the words he had written. The room grew colder, the air thick with a strange, oppressive energy. The typewriter clattered louder, and the words began to shift again. They were no longer just a story. They were his life, his past, his future. Elliot's eyes blurred as the words scrolled across the page in front of him. It was like a memory, but it wasn't his memory. It was the memory of someone else. Someone who had been consumed by the very story Elliot had written. The words were changing everything. He was no longer sure if he was writing or if the story was writing him. The man's hands trembled as he typed, but the words were no longer his own. The story had taken a life of its own, and he was powerless to stop it. Elliot felt the ground shift beneath him, his feet unsteady as the room around him seemed to collapse in on itself. The shadows that had once been mere dark corners now stretched out, growing longer, thicker. The typewriter rattled, the keys moving faster, faster, the words coming so quickly now that they blurred into a single, incomprehensible mass. "You can't escape," the figure's voice echoed again, growing louder, filling the room with its cold, metallic tone. "You'll never escape." Elliot couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, suffocating. The words kept coming, faster, louder, each one a hammer striking his mind, driving him further into madness. The figure was standing behind him now, its presence so close that Elliot could feel its cold breath against his skin. It wasn't just in his mind anymore. It was here, with him, in the room. "You wrote me," the figure whispered. "You created this. This is your life now. You're part of the story. Forever." Elliot wanted to scream. He wanted to fight, to push the typewriter away, but his hands, his body, no longer obeyed him. He couldn't stop writing. The words came faster now, the keys clattering so violently that they seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. The man's mind shattered as the words consumed him. He was no longer human. He was a story, a character in a tale that would never end. The room was now a blur, a swirling vortex of shadows and flickering light. The typewriter seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the keys clattering with each keystroke, faster and faster, until Elliot could no longer distinguish between the words on the page and the thoughts in his mind. His body felt numb, detached from his own actions. He was no longer typing. He was written. The figure loomed over him, its eyes burning with a darkness that consumed everything in its path. Elliot couldn't look away. The figure was the story. The story was the figure. And he was both. "This is who you are now," the figure said, its voice a cold, hollow whisper that echoed in Elliot's skull. "You belong to the story. You always have." The typewriter stilled for a moment, the keys silent. Elliot's hands hovered above the machine, but he didn't move. There was nothing left to move for. The words had stopped, but the silence was worse. The silence was the end. He closed his eyes, knowing what would come next. The final line. The last sentence. The one that would seal his fate. But when he opened his eyes again, the typewriter was gone. The room was still, but empty. The shadows no longer shifted. The air felt thin, stretched, as though reality itself had cracked. He looked down at the page. It was blank. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elliot stood. He walked slowly to the window, the cold light of dawn streaming through the glass. The world outside was unchanged. Normal. But it wasn't normal. Nothing was. The story, the figure, the typewriter, it was all gone. But he knew. He knew that it wasn't over. The typewriter would come back. The story would come back. It would never stop. The figure was still with him. Watching. Waiting. And the worst part? He had written it. Story 2. Tom Bishop had never been one for sentimental possessions. As a child, he had watched his family pass down heirlooms with great reverence, old silverware, frayed quilts, dusty books, and had always thought it a waste. His thoughts were rooted in the practical, what he could buy, what he could use, what he could discard. But then, out of the blue, he received a letter. It had arrived one gray afternoon, nestled among the usual bills and advertisements. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping and ornate in a way that seemed out of place in his modern world of email and text messages. The letter was from an uncle he barely remembered, someone distant, both in geography and relationship. "Dear Tom," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. It is my wish that you inherit the family's legacy, a gift that has been passed down through the generations. It has served us well, and now it's time for you to care for it. I hope you'll understand its importance, though I know you may find it unsettling. Please, come to my home to retrieve it, as it will not be shipped. It must be delivered into your hands directly." It was vague, cryptic even, but curiosity got the better of him. What could be so important? A family heirloom? Perhaps it was just a trinket, a piece of furniture that served no real purpose. But the mention of something unsettling piqued his interest. He remembered the old man vaguely. His aunt and uncle had lived a secluded life in a big, decaying house on the outskirts of town. Tom made up his mind that evening. The next day, he drove the several hours to his uncle's house, unsure of what awaited him. When he arrived, the house was more dilapidated than he remembered. The windows were cracked, the shutters hanging crookedly, and the yard, overgrown with weeds, gave the place a sinister look. A cold gust of wind swept through the trees as Tom knocked on the heavy oak door. It creaked open almost immediately, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of dust and mildew. An elderly woman, his aunt, he assumed, stood in the doorway. She smiled, but there was something hollow in her expression, as if she hadn't smiled in years. "Tom, it's so good to see you," she said, her voice raspy. "We've been expecting you." He nodded, stepping inside. The house had a weight to it, an unnatural silence that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as they walked through the long, narrow hallway. At the end of the corridor, Tom saw it. The object. A large, ornate grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dimly lit room. It was beautiful, but unsettling, its dark wood polished to a glossy sheen. The face of the clock was old-fashioned, with Roman numerals and delicate, faded hands. Yet, something about it was off. The clock was too pristine, too perfect in a way that felt wrong against the backdrop of the otherwise neglected home. "Here it is," his aunt said, motioning toward the clock with an almost reverent gesture. "It's yours now." Tom looked at the clock, his curiosity growing. "What is it?" he asked. "It's a family heirloom," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. "It has been with us for generations. But it is not like any ordinary clock. It has a power, one that we cannot control." Tom laughed nervously. "A power? Come on, Aunt Edith, this is just a clock." But as soon as the words left his mouth, something in the air shifted. A chill crept up his spine, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something in the reflection of the clock's glass, an image, fleeting and distorted, of a person standing behind him. "You'll understand soon enough," his aunt said softly. "You always were the skeptical one, Tom." After his aunt's cryptic words, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He had to admit, the clock felt different from anything he had seen before. It seemed alive, as though it was watching him, waiting for something. After a brief conversation with his aunt, she excused herself, and Tom was left alone in the dark, oppressive house. He wandered back into the living room where the clock stood, its tick-tock echoing in the otherwise silent house. It was late, but Tom couldn't bring himself to leave. He found himself drawn to the clock, inexplicably compelled to get closer. He reached out and touched the cold, smooth wood. As soon as his fingers made contact, a shock of electricity ran through him, making him jerk his hand back. A low hum filled the room, a faint vibration that seemed to come from the clock itself. The ticking, once steady, seemed to slow, then speed up. Time felt distorted, fractured. He glanced up at the clock face. The hands were moving, but not in the normal way. They were ticking backward. Tom blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The hands were now clearly moving in reverse, the seconds being pulled back, the minutes reversing. He stepped closer, unsure if he was imagining things. Could this be real? Could the clock somehow be rewinding time? Before he could process the implications of what he was seeing, the door creaked open behind him, and his aunt entered the room again, her face a mask of sadness. "It's begun, hasn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The clock always chooses its moment. And now it has chosen you." Tom turned to face her, his mind racing. "What do you mean? What's happening?" His aunt's face was pale. "It doesn't just count time, Tom. It rewinds it. But it only works for you, not for anyone else." Tom stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What are you saying? I don't understand." "The clock," she said, her voice shaking, "it rewinds the time for the person who owns it. You. It takes memories. It takes moments from your life, erasing them and rewinding time so that you forget. It's not just a clock, it's a curse." Tom stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his aunt had just told him. He had to be hearing things. This couldn't be real. A cursed clock? It sounded like something out of a bad horror novel. But then, something happened. Something small, but significant. As he stood there, staring at the clock, he realized something was missing, something from his own life. His aunt had spoken of moments being erased, memories being stolen, and suddenly, he couldn't remember where he had left his wallet. It wasn't on the table or in his pocket. It should have been with him, but it was gone. He checked his pockets, his bag, but nothing. A cold dread crept over him as he realized that he couldn't remember the last time he had seen the wallet, couldn't even remember how long he'd had it. "Where did it go?" he muttered to himself. But the worst realization hit him moments later. Why couldn't he remember? He looked at his aunt, who was staring at him with a haunted look in her eyes. She hadn't moved since she'd spoken. "Uncle Frank," he whispered, unsure where the name came from. Her face contorted with pain. She shook her head, looking away. "He's gone, Tom. He's been gone for years." Tom's mind was racing now. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And the clock, it had something to do with it. "I need to leave," he muttered, his voice shaky. But as he turned toward the door, he froze. The clock's hands had moved again, backwards. And the ticking was now a frantic, maddening rhythm. Something was coming, and Tom wasn't sure he could outrun it. The chill that had settled in Tom's chest refused to lift. As he turned to leave, his footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, the sound far too loud in the silence of the old house. The weight of his aunt's words lingered, and with each step he took toward the door, the room seemed to close in on him. The sensation of the air pressing in was suffocating. When he reached the front door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. A flash of doubt flared in his chest. Was it possible? Was this all just a joke, a twisted prank? It didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. And Tom wasn't sure if he could trust himself anymore. What was happening to him? Why couldn't he remember simple things like where he'd left his wallet? He glanced back toward the living room, and the grandfather clock caught his eye. The hands were moving again, ticking backward, as though it was in sync with the pulse of his dread. Against his better judgment, Tom walked back toward the clock, his mind swirling with fear and confusion. There was something in the room now, something that seemed to throb with an unnatural energy. The walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the clock, pulsing as though it was alive, its hands unwinding time with each tick. He reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed the polished wood of the clock. The cold that had already gripped his chest now spread through his hand, creeping up his arm. And as his fingers made contact, he felt it, a subtle but undeniable shift in reality, as though something was being peeled away from his mind. The world blurred for a moment, and Tom gasped, pulling his hand away. His breath came in ragged gasps as his heart pounded in his chest. For a split second, he had a vision, a flash, really, of a different version of the room, one where the furniture was rearranged, where the walls weren't as cracked, and the light coming through the windows seemed less dim. His aunt was sitting in a chair, staring at him, her face different, younger. He blinked, but the vision was gone, as if it had never existed. Was that a memory? Was he remembering something he hadn't lived? The idea sent his pulse racing, and he felt like he was on the edge of some precipice, his mind trembling as though it could snap under the strain. Get out. Get out of this house. But something rooted him to the spot. The clock was ticking louder now, almost deafening. His breath hitched as he realized that with every backward tick, his sense of time was slipping further away. Tom turned abruptly, his legs shaking as he rushed toward the door again. His aunt's voice, soft but urgent, reached him just as his hand touched the handle. "Tom," she called, her voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't place. "You don't understand. It's not just time. It's memory." He froze, the words hitting him like a brick. His mind raced back to the wallet. His mind raced to the uncertainty he'd felt when he couldn't recall the last time he had it. It was more than just things being out of place. It was deeper than that. "Memory," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "The clock doesn't just undo time," she continued, stepping toward him slowly. "It erases it. Takes it from you. It makes you forget. It makes you forget people, events, whole years. The more you touch it, the more it rewinds, the more you lose. You lose them, Tom." She seemed to sag under the weight of her own words, her face pale. "It took your uncle. Took me too, in a way," she whispered. "And now it's after you." Tom's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" He took a step back, his head spinning. "How can a clock do that? How could?" She interrupted him, her voice rising. "You won't remember," she said desperately, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. "You won't remember what it does to you. You won't remember the people it takes. And when it takes you, when it's done with you, you'll be like me, a shadow. A ghost." The reality of her words hit him harder than he expected. The room around them seemed to shift once more. The shadows grew longer, stretching out toward the clock, their tendrils creeping across the floor like living things. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Tom could see his breath in the air. His hand gripped the doorknob tightly, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The clock. I don't understand, he whispered. His voice cracked, hoarse. His aunt's face was now almost ghostly, pale, as if she had aged years in mere moments. Was she already lost to the clock? Was she a ghost in her own life? I can't remember who I am anymore, she sobbed, her eyes vacant. I'm still here, but I'm not here. I'm gone, Tom. And soon, you'll be too. The clock's tick-tock sounded louder now, drawing out everything else. The weight of it, the sheer heaviness of time collapsing in on itself, was unbearable. And Tom understood it now. He understood why his aunt was so frantic. He understood what was happening to him. He was losing himself. He was losing them. With a final glance at the clock, Tom turned the doorknob and yanked the door open. The cold air outside felt like a slap to his face. But when he stepped into the hallway, it was no longer the same. The hallway stretched on for miles. The walls bent and twisted, disorienting and infinite, as if the house had no end. Tom stumbled backward, panic seizing his chest. The walls had never been like this. The hallway had always been a short stretch to the door, leading to the rest of the house. But now, it was a labyrinth. Something whispered behind him, a voice that didn't belong to anyone. A low, guttural sound that filled his ears, drawing him back toward the clock. He turned, his heart racing, but his legs refused to move. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, and he was plunged into darkness. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps. The oppressive silence settled over him like a blanket. The walls were closing in again, and the house, no, the clock, was starting to take over. He knew it now. He knew what he had to do, but the horror of it paralyzed him. The clock had already started to unravel his reality, and every minute that passed, he felt a little more detached from the world he had once known. His mind couldn't grasp the full weight of it. He couldn't process the idea that the things he had written, the people he had known, were disappearing into thin air. They were being erased. And he was the one who had let it happen. The footsteps behind him grew louder. Closer. But they weren't his. Tom spun around. And there it was, standing in the doorway, a dark figure, waiting. It was the clock. It had come for him. The chill that had settled in Tom's chest refused to lift. As he turned to leave, his footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, the sound far too loud in the silence of the old house. The weight of his aunt's words lingered, and with each step he took toward the door, the room seemed to close in on him. The sensation of the air pressing in was suffocating. When he reached the front door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. A flash of doubt flared in his chest. Was it possible? Was this all just a joke, a twisted prank? It didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. And Tom wasn't sure if he could trust himself anymore. What was happening to him? Why couldn't he remember simple things like where he'd left his wallet? He glanced back toward the living room, and the grandfather clock caught his eye. The hands were moving again, ticking backward, as though it was in sync with the pulse of his dread. Against his better judgment, Tom walked back toward the clock, his mind swirling with fear and confusion. There was something in the room now, something that seemed to throb with an unnatural energy. The walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the clock, pulsing as though it was alive, its hands unwinding time with each tick. He reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed the polished wood of the clock. The cold that had already gripped his chest now spread through his hand, creeping up his arm. And as his fingers made contact, he felt it, a subtle but undeniable shift in reality, as though something was being peeled away from his mind. The world blurred for a moment, and Tom gasped, pulling his hand away. His breath came in ragged gasps as his heart pounded in his chest. For a split second, he had a vision, a flash, really, of a different version of the room, one where the furniture was rearranged, where the walls weren't as cracked, and the light coming through the windows seemed less dim. His aunt was sitting in a chair, staring at him, her face different, younger. He blinked, but the vision was gone, as if it had never existed. Was that a memory? Was he remembering something he hadn't lived? The idea sent his pulse racing, and he felt like he was on the edge of some precipice, his mind trembling as though it could snap under the strain. Get out. Get out of this house. But something rooted him to the spot. The clock was ticking louder now, almost deafening. His breath hitched as he realized that with every backward tick, his sense of time was slipping further away. Tom turned abruptly, his legs shaking as he rushed toward the door again. His aunt's voice, soft but urgent, reached him just as his hand touched the handle. "Tom," she called, her voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't place. "You don't understand. It's not just time. It's memory." He froze, the words hitting him like a brick. His mind raced back to the wallet. His mind raced to the uncertainty he'd felt when he couldn't recall the last time he had it. It was more than just things being out of place. It was deeper than that. "Memory," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "The clock doesn't just undo time," she continued, stepping toward him slowly. "It erases it. Takes it from you. It makes you forget. It makes you forget people, events, whole years. The more you touch it, the more it rewinds, the more you lose. You lose them, Tom." She seemed to sag under the weight of her own words, her face pale. "It took your uncle. Took me too, in a way," she whispered. "And now it's after you." Tom's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" He took a step back, his head spinning. "How can a clock do that? How could?" She interrupted him, her voice rising. "You won't remember," she said desperately, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. "You won't remember what it does to you. You won't remember the people it takes. And when it takes you, when it's done with you, you'll be like me, a shadow. A ghost." The reality of her words hit him harder than he expected. The room around him seemed to shift once more. The shadows grew longer, stretching out toward the clock, their tendrils creeping across the floor like living things. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Tom could see his breath in the air. His hand gripped the doorknob tightly, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The clock. "I don't understand," he whispered. His voice cracked, hoarse. His aunt's face was now almost ghostly, pale, as if she had aged years in mere moments. Was she already lost to the clock? Was she a ghost in her own life? "I can't remember who I am anymore," she sobbed, her eyes vacant. "I'm still here, but I'm not here. I'm gone, Tom. And soon, you'll be too." The clock's tick-tock sounded louder now, drying out everything else. The weight of it, the sheer heaviness of time collapsing in on itself, was unbearable. And Tom understood it now. He understood why his aunt was so frantic. He understood what was happening to him. He was losing himself. He was losing them. With a final glance at the clock, Tom turned the doorknob and yanked the door open. The cold air outside felt like a slap to his face. But when he stepped into the hallway, it was no longer the same. The hallway stretched on for miles. The walls bent and twisted, disorienting and infinite, as if the house had no end. Tom stumbled backward, panic seizing his chest. The walls had never been like this. The hallway had always been a short stretch to the door, leading to the rest of the house. But now, it was a labyrinth. Something whispered behind him, a voice that didn't belong to anyone. A low, guttural sound that filled his ears, drawing him back toward the clock. He turned, his heart racing, but his legs refused to move. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, and he was plunged into darkness. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps. The oppressive silence settled over him like a blanket. The walls were closing in again, and the house, no, the clock, was starting to take over. He knew it now. He knew what he had to do, but the horror of it paralyzed him. The clock had already started to unravel his reality, and every minute that passed, he felt a little more detached from the world he had once known. His mind couldn't grasp the full weight of it. He couldn't process the idea that the things he had written, the people he had known, were disappearing into thin air. They were being erased. And he was the one who had let it happen. The footsteps behind him grew louder. Closer. But they weren't his. Tom spun around. And there it was, standing in the doorway, a dark figure, waiting. It was the clock. It had come for him. Tom's eyes snapped open, and the first thing he noticed was the silence. There was no ticking of the clock, no whirring of time spinning backward. For a moment, he thought the nightmare was over, that everything was fine again. His body felt strange, like he had been asleep for years, and his mind was foggy. Slowly, he sat up, rubbing his temples. The room was dark. Not just dim, empty. The walls of his uncle's house, once filled with echoes of footsteps and whispers, were now just blank, lifeless structures. Tom blinked, disoriented, his heart thudding in his chest. He had to get up. He had to leave. But when he stood, he felt the weight of the house, the weight of time pressing down on him. The world didn't feel real. Everything was off-kilter, warped, and strange. The floor beneath him shifted, as though the ground had become liquid, and the walls seemed to stretch into an endless void. He turned around, panic rising in his throat, and saw something horrifying, the clock. It stood in the corner of the room, just as it had before, its hands frozen at midnight. Tom stepped forward cautiously, his heart racing as his eyes locked on the timepiece. The air was thick with a strange energy, the kind that made him feel small and insignificant. His breath was shallow, his chest tight. He wanted to touch it, to destroy it, but the thought of doing so filled him with dread. What if it happened again? What if the clock rewound his life once more? You can't escape, Tom. The voice, his own voice, echoed in his mind. The figure from before, the twisted reflection of himself, had spoken those words. And now, they echoed like a dark mantra, reverberating through his skull. The fear that had been gnawing at him finally broke through, and his knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed, his palms hitting the floor as he gasped for air. His mind was spinning. The memories of what had happened, of what he had lost, came crashing down all at once, too overwhelming to comprehend. His aunt, his uncle, gone. His friends, his life, erased. Was this his punishment for touching the clock? Was this the price he had to pay for whatever had happened to him? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no going back. He was stuck in this endless loop, trapped in a world that didn't belong to him. Tom couldn't bear it. He couldn't breathe. He needed to break free. As the minutes, no, hours, dragged on, Tom's mind teetered between waking and dreaming. The house was an endless nightmare, the walls shifting and warping as though they were alive. The clock, now silent and unmoving, stood like a sentinel at the heart of it all. But something was changing. Tom could feel it. There was a presence, something lurking just out of sight, watching him. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to face whatever had been chasing him through this madness. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't escape it. Not unless he confronted it. The whispers began again. Low, barely audible, but unmistakable. You wrote me. You can never undo it. The voice was distorted, reverberating in his mind like an echo from another time. It wasn't just a voice, it was a memory. A memory that had no right to exist, and yet it was there, gnawing at his sanity. Tom's chest tightened, and his vision blurred. The more he focused on the whispers, the more he felt himself slipping away. It was as if the very act of remembering was erasing him, erasing the world around him. His mind was unraveling, each thread snapping and pulling him deeper into a chasm of madness. And then, in the midst of his growing hysteria, the clock began to tick again. At first, it was slow, almost hesitant. But then the ticking gained speed, faster and faster, until it was deafening. Tom's pulse raced in time with the clock, the rhythm pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. He stumbled to his feet, feeling his breath quicken as he stumbled toward the clock. It was calling to him. But the closer he got, the more the world around him began to warp. The air turned thick with smoke, the walls bending like they were made of rubber, the floor beneath his feet giving way. His vision blurred as the house itself seemed to distort, pulling him in every direction at once. You can't escape this. The voice was no longer distant. It was here, right next to him, a cold whisper in his ear. You wrote me. You can never escape what you've created. Tom staggered, his hands outstretched as if to steady himself, but the room was spinning, and he couldn't find his balance. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking. The clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. It was everywhere now, overwhelming him, drowning him in its relentless march of time. In the distance, a figure appeared. A shadow, barely visible in the darkness, moving toward him with unnatural speed. Tom's breath caught in his throat. It was him. Or rather, it was the other him, the twisted version of himself that had haunted him from the start. He reached for the clock, but as his hand brushed against the cold wood, it jerked back. The hands of the clock were no longer ticking backward. They were moving forward now, racing ahead, faster than he could comprehend. And then, it all stopped. Time froze. Tom was still standing in front of the clock, his heart racing, his breath shallow. But the world around him was still. The room had stopped moving. The house had stopped breathing. For a long moment, everything was silent. Tom looked down at his hands, which were still gripping the clock. He could feel the wood beneath his fingertips, cool and solid, but there was something strange about it now. It felt wrong, as though it was slipping out of his grasp, as though his very presence was unwelcome here. Then, as if the universe itself had caught its breath, the clock struck one final, deafening chime. The sound was like a bell tolling for the dead, reverberating through the room with an intensity that rattled Tom's bones. It was the last sound he would ever hear. And then everything collapsed. The walls, the floor, the house, the clock. Tom felt himself falling, spiraling into an abyss, the darkness swallowing him whole. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was nothing left. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the clock's hands, frozen, as if mocking him. Then, silence. Story 3. Lucas didn't particularly enjoy his house. It was old, dated, and had a peculiar weight to it, like it had absorbed every moment of its long history into its bones. But it was his. Or at least it had been, since the bank approved his mortgage 3 years ago. The house sat on the edge of a sleepy, nondescript neighborhood. From the outside, it seemed like any other, 2 stories, a porch with a single rocking chair, a small yard overrun with weeds, but inside, it was a different story. There were oddities, things he couldn't explain. Cold drafts in rooms that shouldn't have them, whispers in the hallway when no one else was home, and the way the floorboards creaked at night, even when he was alone. But the basement, with its low ceilings and flickering lights, was the worst of it. It was musty, cluttered with old furniture and boxes left behind by previous tenants. Lucas had avoided it, relegating it to the back of his mind, only going down when necessary. Until that day. That day was like any other, quiet, uneventful, until he decided to tackle the last of the boxes in the basement. His plan had been simple: clear it out, make the space usable for once. But the moment he pulled open the basement door, an unsettling chill hit him in the face. The air smelled damp and heavy, as though it had been sealed in for years. Lucas flicked on the light, and the bulb sputtered to life with a dull hum. As the harsh yellow light filled the room, he hesitated. His gaze drifted over the cluttered mess, old paintings, a dresser, broken lamps, and then something caught his eye. Something out of place. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by a stack of old crates, was a door. It wasn't part of the layout. He had seen the basement 100 times, yet he had never noticed it before. The door seemed to blend into the wall, its edges smooth, unmarked, like it had always been there but had never been noticed. It was made of old wood, warped and uneven, with a brass handle that gleamed, though the rest of the room looked worn and forgotten. A chill ran down his spine, but curiosity overpowered his hesitation. He walked toward it, pushing aside the crates that had concealed it. The door was cold to the touch, its wood rough against his fingertips. Tom ran his hand over the surface, feeling for any hidden mechanisms, but the door was just a door. Yet, it felt wrong. He could hear the faintest of murmurs from the other side, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. What is this? He thought, his breath shallow. He pulled the handle. The door creaked open with a slow, grinding sound, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He hesitated for a moment, his hand still gripping the cold brass handle, but then, driven by some nameless impulse, he pushed it all the way open. The room beyond the door was dark. Not just shadowed, but impossibly black. A thick, suffocating darkness that felt as if it stretched on forever. Lucas squinted, trying to adjust to the lack of light, but no matter how hard he stared, he couldn't make out anything. It was as though the darkness itself was a living thing, pushing against his vision. A gust of cold air blew out of the doorway, sharp and biting. It made Lucas's skin prickle and his breath catch in his throat. But he couldn't turn away. Something in the air was pulling him, urging him forward. And despite the unease spreading through him, he took a step inside. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound amplified by the silence. The moment he entered, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that made him jump. He spun around, heart pounding, but the door was solid. No sign of a draft or breeze. It had just closed. A sense of vertigo swept over him, and his mind began to spin. He was used to being alone, but this space felt alive, like it was watching him. Like it had always been waiting. In the pitch black, he felt his way around the room, finding nothing but air and a creeping sense of wrongness. There were no windows, no furniture, no other doors, just the suffocating darkness, thick like a fog. It felt like hours passed, and yet, the more Lucas tried to orient himself, the more disoriented he became. The air felt heavy, pressing against him as if the house itself was alive, breathing down his neck. And then it came. The noise. A faint scratching, like fingernails against wood. So soft, so distant, that he wasn't sure he had heard it at all. But then again, there was no mistaking it. It came again, louder this time, echoing from the depths of the room. "Hello?" Lucas's voice was weak, trembling, but no reply came. His heart hammered in his chest, and he cursed under his breath, turning toward the door, but when he tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. His pulse quickened. The scratching continued, now followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Come closer." It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it felt familiar. It felt like someone he knew. The whisper grew louder, growing sharper, more distinct. It was as if the darkness around him was vibrating with the voice, bending to its will. He could feel his heartbeat echoing in his ears, a frantic thumping that nearly drowned out the whispers. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice breaking, but the only response was the persistent scratching and the voice, growing nearer. "Come closer. It's not what you think." He recoiled, feeling a cold sweat break out across his skin. The voice was strange, distant, but somehow intimately familiar. His mind raced, trying to place it. But there was nothing. No memories, no associations. Just a cold certainty that this thing knew him in ways he couldn't understand. He stepped backward, trying to retrace his steps, trying to find the door, but the darkness seemed to stretch farther than it had before, the room expanding in ways that defied logic. The walls, if there were any, seemed to close in on him. There was no way out. No escape. Just the scratching and that damn voice. Then the floor beneath him shifted. His feet stumbled as the room seemed to tilt, just a little. He gasped for air as dizziness overtook him, the floor becoming unstable beneath him. It was then that the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift. Something moved. Something large. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely visible but growing clearer with each passing second. It was tall, looming over him, its outline shifting unnaturally. As it stepped into the dim light, Lucas's heart stopped. It was him, someone he knew, or at least someone he should have known. But there was no name to match the face. The figure was wearing clothes that looked familiar, as though they belonged to him, yet the man himself looked distorted, wrong. His eyes, hollow, black, stared at Lucas with an unblinking gaze. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it said, its voice twisted and low. Suddenly, the reality of the moment hit him like a slap in the face. The door had never been part of the house. It had never been on any blueprint. It had no right to be here. But now, Lucas understood. The door, the figure, the whispers, they were all connected. Something had followed him from the other side of the door. Something dark, something hungry. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure smiled, and the room plunged into darkness once again. The darkness swallowed him whole. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer. His heart pounded in his ears, the sound drowning out everything around him. The weight of the shadow in front of him seemed to pull him deeper into the room, into the abyss, into whatever nightmare he had unleashed. His legs felt like jelly, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It wasn't just the man's presence that terrified him. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense of being watched, of being judged by something ancient, something far beyond his understanding. This man, this thing, wasn't merely a person. He was a conduit. A vessel for something darker, something hungry. "You don't belong here," the figure said, his voice low, gravelly, but oddly soothing, as if it were speaking directly into Lucas's mind. Lucas couldn't move. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the fear curling inside of him. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile that made you question your very existence, the kind that twisted reality, distorting everything you thought you knew. "You opened the door, Lucas," the figure continued. "And now you will see what happens when curiosity becomes a curse." Lucas stepped back, his mind reeling. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted his head, considering the question. "What I want is irrelevant," he said softly. "What matters is what you've brought into this world." The room seemed to grow darker, colder, as if the figure's words had ripped a hole in the air. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the space with an unearthly hum that gnawed at Lucas's sanity. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He looked around frantically for an escape, but there was nothing, only the cold, impenetrable darkness and the figure that was slowly encroaching upon him. "You brought it here," the figure said again, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "And now you will see the price." The figure's words echoed in Lucas's mind, over and over again, each repetition like a drumbeat in his skull. He stumbled backward, but his feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. It was as if the house itself was swallowing him whole. The walls, once solid and steadfast, seemed to twist and stretch, like the house was alive, reacting to the figure's presence. The cold that had settled in the room deepened, wrapping itself around Lucas like a suffocating blanket. His heart raced, but the fear in his chest was no longer just about the figure in front of him. It was about the house, about the door, and about what had followed him through it. Suddenly, the floor beneath him cracked. A sharp, deafening sound filled the room, and Lucas felt his balance shift. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground with a grunt, his hands scraping against the rough, splintering floorboards. The figure moved closer, looming over him like a shadow that blotted out the dim light. "Do you understand now?" the figure whispered, his breath cold against Lucas's ear. "The door is not just a door. It is a threshold. A gateway." Lucas's mind reeled, struggling to grasp the meaning behind the words. A gateway? But to what? The figure seemed to sense his confusion, for he chuckled softly, as if amused by Lucas's disbelief. "It takes, Lucas," the figure said, his voice soft, almost tender. "It takes your memories, your time, your life. And once it has taken everything, it gives nothing in return. It leaves you hollow." The room seemed to bend around him, and Lucas could feel his sense of reality slipping. He had come into this house seeking a simple life, a place of peace. But now, it seemed that peace had been ripped away, and he was caught in the grip of something far darker than he could comprehend. The figure's voice grew more urgent, more insistent. "This house, this place, is where it all began. And now it ends with you." Lucas's mind spun as he struggled to understand. He couldn't focus on the figure, couldn't grasp the reality of what was happening. He was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. "Who am I?" Lucas gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" The figure leaned in close, his face coming into view for the first time. His eyes were black, empty, endless voids that swallowed every ounce of hope. "You're the one who opened the door," the figure said, his voice low and venomous. "You're the one who allowed it all to happen." The figure's words pierced through Lucas's mind like a needle. His vision blurred, the room around him fading into a haze of distortion. He felt as though he was sinking, falling into the very darkness the figure had conjured. His limbs were numb, his heart pounding louder and louder in his ears, but it wasn't enough. He needed to get out, he needed to escape. But the more he struggled, the more the room seemed to close in on him. The walls were pushing toward him, the air thick with a heaviness that made it impossible to breathe. Every inch of the room felt alive, moving, shifting with some malevolent force that pressed down on him. "You can't escape," the figure whispered, his voice growing fainter, but still, somehow, louder in Lucas's mind. "Not from this place. Not from it." The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe, stretching toward him like hands, like tendrils reaching out to drag him into the dark. Lucas could feel them closing in, and he gasped for air, his lungs burning with the need to breathe. Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way completely. He was falling into the darkness. The figure's face vanished as he plummeted, but his voice, his terrible, echoing voice, remained. "Once you enter, you can never leave." And then, nothing. Silence. When Lucas opened his eyes again, he was back in the living room. The room that had once felt like his refuge now felt alien. The air was thick with the weight of everything he had just experienced, but something had changed. The house felt different now, older, more oppressive. The door to the basement was closed. But Lucas knew, deep down, that the door had never closed. It had never truly been closed. It was still there. The whispers returned, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and Lucas's eyes locked onto it, his pulse quickening. For a fleeting moment, he almost thought he saw it, the hand spinning backward, as though time itself was unraveling. "Not again," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Not again." But the whispers, growing louder, refused to let him forget. Lucas stood in the living room, staring at the closed basement door, his mind reeling from the strange, horrifying encounter with the figure. The house felt colder now, darker, as if the very walls were closing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with the feeling of impending doom. The whispers, those distant, maddening whispers, were back, echoing softly in the corners of his mind. He couldn't make out the words, but their tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting, as if they were aware of his every move. He stepped back, his legs unsteady, as though the very ground beneath him had shifted. The floorboards creaked, the house groaning as if in response to his every movement. Lucas shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling that everything around him was somehow wrong. But the more he fought against it, the more the sense of dread tightened around him like a noose. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "You can't escape. You opened the door. And now you're trapped." His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, but he stopped himself before he touched it. It felt like an anchor, like if he touched it again, everything would collapse. His heart hammered in his chest, and the walls seemed to close in, the space growing smaller, tighter. He couldn't go back. But he couldn't stay here either. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of indistinct voices, urging him forward. He couldn't make sense of them. His mind swirled in confusion. Everything felt like a dream, a nightmare that refused to end, no matter how hard he tried to wake up. He reached for the door once more, his fingers brushing against the cold brass handle. But as he touched it, the whispering stopped. The air went still, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Something was waiting for him on the other side. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the weight of what lay behind the door pressed against him, heavier than he could bear. His mind raced, his thoughts muddled. He had to open it. He had to face whatever was lurking behind that door. He twisted the handle and pushed. The door swung open with a creak, revealing the familiar, yet alien, darkness of the basement beyond. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, but beneath that, Lucas could smell something else. Something sour. A scent of decay. But that wasn't what held his attention. It was the shadows. They were moving, twisting, contorting in unnatural ways. Like fingers reaching out from the void, stretching toward him. The darkness was alive, and it was waiting. Watching. Lucas's heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. He should have run. He should have slammed the door shut and locked it forever. But something inside him, something deep within the pit of his stomach, refused to let him leave. Instead, he stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that made him jump. He spun around, but the darkness was now absolute. There was no light. No way to see. No way to escape. The house seemed to breathe around him, each creak and groan of the floorboards amplifying in the silence. His heartbeat thudded in his chest, louder than anything. The whispers returned, more distinct now, the voices calling to him, pulling him further into the depths of the basement. Come closer. The air around him grew colder, and his breath turned to mist in front of him. He could feel the weight of something pressing down on him, suffocating him. His body trembled, but not from the cold. From something far worse. Come closer, come closer. It was his own voice, but distorted, echoing in the darkness. His mind reeled, the sound of his own words, twisted and warped, consuming him. He stumbled forward, almost against his will, as though the darkness itself were guiding him. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the very edge of his sanity. He couldn't control his movements, couldn't stop himself from advancing, even as the fear surged within him. The shadows around him thickened, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He reached out to steady himself on something, anything, but his hand met only air. The basement had become a vast, endless space, stretching farther than it should have. Something was wrong. He turned in place, trying to see, trying to make sense of the vastness of the space that seemed to stretch beyond the dimensions of the house. The walls were gone. There was nothing but darkness. And the clock. It was there. He didn't know how, but it was there. The familiar ticking began again. Slow at first, then faster, relentless. Suddenly, the floor beneath him cracked. The crack sounded like thunder, splitting the air with a violent, jarring noise. Lucas froze, his eyes wide, as the floor beneath him began to split open, revealing a vast, empty chasm. The darkness below was absolute. He could feel it pulling at him, pulling him into its depths. The clock ticked faster now, a chaotic, frantic rhythm matching the pounding of his heart. The house around him groaned and shifted, as if it were alive, reshaping itself. He could hear something moving, something large, beneath the floorboards, scratching, scraping, pulling itself toward him. No, I won't let it happen. I won't let it take me. His voice was weak, broken, but he fought against the pull, fighting against the weight of the darkness that threatened to drag him under. With every ounce of strength left in him, he turned away from the crack in the floor and ran, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground. But no matter how fast he ran, the darkness pursued him. The ticking followed, growing louder with every step. It won't stop. It won't let you escape. The whisper grew louder, more pronounced, as though it were in his very mind. The walls pressed on him, suffocating him. Every breath was harder to take, each step heavier than the last. And yet, still, he couldn't escape. And then, as he reached what he thought was the end of the basement, a figure appeared before him. It was the same figure. The one from before. The one who had warned him, taunted him. The one who had smiled and told him that he would never escape. The figure stood motionless, a grotesque shadow in the middle of the room. Its face was still hidden, its eyes nothing more than voids. You shouldn't have opened the door, the figure whispered. And just like that, everything stopped. The figure lunged forward, faster than any human could move, and Lucas screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness. The room around him went silent, as if time itself had frozen. The last thing Lucas saw was the clock's hands, spinning backward at an incomprehensible speed until everything faded to black. And then, nothing. Lucas's eyes snapped open. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the eerie, uncomfortable silence of the dark basement he just left, but a stillness that felt even worse, as if something had stopped. No, something had ended. The air was thick with a strange heaviness, as though the very atmosphere had conspired to smother him. He was lying on the floor, but this was not the basement, nor was it his living room. The surface beneath him was smooth, polished, metal. He pushed himself up slowly, his hands bracing against the cold surface. The moment he rose to a sitting position, he noticed something. It wasn't just a feeling of unfamiliarity that clawed at his mind. The walls. He turned, slowly at first, and then with a growing sense of dread. The room was not a room at all. The walls were blank, utterly devoid of decoration or texture, just endless stretches of white nothingness. There were no windows, no doors, no escape. He was trapped in an infinite expanse of sterile, empty space. His breath quickened. He had been here before. This place, it felt like a dream, but more like a nightmare. A memory lost in the fog of time, a shadow lurking just beyond the edges of his consciousness. And then it hit him. The door. The door that shouldn't have existed. He had opened it, hadn't he? He'd unlocked the secret to this place, to this nightmare. The room around him was starting to grow darker, the air colder. The walls shifted slightly, but not enough to be tangible. He wasn't sure whether he was seeing things or if the very space he occupied was warping itself, but there was no mistaking the feeling that this place was alive in the most malevolent sense possible. There was something coming. Something inevitable. A shiver ran down his spine, and the cold in the room deepened, settling into his bones. He was no longer alone. He heard it first, the faintest rustle, a whisper that sounded like wind but didn't quite behave like it. The very fabric of the air seemed to hum with an unfamiliar energy, something that wasn't quite sound but not quite silence either. And then he saw the movement, a shadow shifting at the far end of the room. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible. But it grew, expanding, rising. It wasn't a man. Or if it wasn't like any man Lucas had ever seen. The figure appeared out of the growing darkness, its outline obscured, but Lucas felt it more than saw it, like a presence in the room, something pressing against him, something demanding his attention. The air grew heavier with each step the figure took toward him. "Do you see now, Lucas?" the figure asked, its voice a low, rumbling whisper that filled the empty space, the sound crawling into Lucas's skull like 1,000 insects. It was the same voice. The voice of the figure from before, the one who had warned him, the one who had shown him the darkness. But this time, it was different. The figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer with every passing second. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black as the void, endless pits that swallowed everything in their gaze. Its features, once human, had now become grotesque, twisted, like some horrific parody of a man. The edges of its face were blurred, as if the figure couldn't fully hold shape in this place. It was not bound by the limits of the physical world. "You were warned," it continued, its voice now an unbearable weight. "The door was never meant for you. You opened it, and now it's too late. The house, The door, they are part of you now, Lucas. You belong to it. Lucas's breath caught in his throat, his heart slamming against his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, to fight against the force that gripped him. But his body refused to respond. The figure was in control now. It was too late to turn back. You can't escape it, the figure said, its voice filled with something that was almost pity. This is where you will stay. You'll never leave. You'll never forget. The weight of the words hit Lucas like a physical blow, and in that moment, something shifted within him. He understood. He understood what had happened. What was happening? The figure reached out to touch him, and as its fingers brushed against his arm, a shock ran through his body, paralyzing him. The room spun wildly, and Lucas's mind reeled. The memories, the fragments of his life, began to come back. Pieces, jumbled and broken, like shards of glass catching in the air. Faces, places, events. Everything he had lost, every person he had known, flashed before his eyes, but not in the way they should have been. No, they were twisted now, distorted. The people he remembered weren't his people anymore. They were images, echoes, trapped within this distorted space. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison. A prison built on the lies of time, and Lucas had unlocked its gates. How did it feel, Lucas? The figure's voice was softer now, almost mocking. How did it feel to know you had the power to rewrite everything? To pull memories from the void? But that's the catch, isn't it? You thought you controlled it. You thought you could change things. But no one can change the past. The room warped further, twisting and bending as the very fabric of time and space unraveled around him. Lucas felt himself being pulled into the darkness, his body no longer obeying his commands. His limbs were heavy, his thoughts fractured, splintering apart like glass. The figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating. Now you know the truth, the figure whispered, leaning closer, its breath cold and damp against his ear. The door wasn't just a door. It was a curse you've inherited. And now that you've opened it, there's no going back. Lucas wanted to scream, to fight, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure's laugh echoed in his mind, a low, hollow sound that made his skin crawl. The room around him began to spin faster, faster, until the walls seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only blackness in its wake. The whispers, the voices, the laughter, all mixed together in a chaotic symphony of madness. And then, everything went still. When Lucas opened his eyes again, he was lying on the floor in his living room. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythm familiar, comforting even. The house was silent. The door to the basement was gone. It had all been a dream, hadn't it? But Lucas knew. He knew it hadn't been a dream. The door was gone, yes, but the darkness remained. And something had changed. The house was still there, but it felt different now. It felt wrong. As though it were waiting. Watching. The door that shouldn't exist was no longer visible, but Lucas could still feel its presence. He could still hear the whispers, distant, faint, but unmistakable. The house had claimed him, just as the figure had said. And now, Lucas knew he was trapped. trapped in a world that was not his own. The door might be gone, but the curse remained. And as the clock ticked on, Lucas understood the terrible truth: some doors should never be opened. Story 4. The university library was always an eerie place, but tonight it felt different. As Evan stepped into the massive, dimly lit space, the smell of dust and old paper filled his nostrils. It was a smell he had become accustomed to during his years at the university, but tonight it seemed sharper, more invasive, as though the air itself was pressing against him. The large, imposing shelves towered above him, their spines filled with books, some ancient, some newer, yet all with the same quiet promise of knowledge within their pages. The only sound in the cavernous room was the soft creak of wooden floorboards beneath his shoes, and the gentle rustling of the pages as a gust of wind slipped through the cracks in the windows. Evan had always been a creature of habit, a student who favored the solitude of this grand building over the chaos of the outside world. He found comfort in its silence, in the way time seemed to slow down between the walls of the library. But tonight, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, something unsettling, something waiting. The library was open late tonight, as it often was for final exams, and he needed to finish a paper for his literature class. But as he walked through the aisles, something caught his eye, a particular book, sitting just slightly askew on the shelf. It wasn't a book he recognized. In fact, it wasn't a book that should have been there. The leather-bound tome looked old, its cover a faded, cracked brown, with no title. Its pages were yellowed with age, and a faint, sickly glow seemed to emanate from within. Evan felt an odd compulsion to touch it. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool, rough texture of the cover. As soon as his hand made contact, he felt a shiver run up his spine, a pulse of electricity zipping through him, leaving a lingering numbness. He pulled the book from the shelf, staring at it with confusion. He had never seen this book before, nor had he ever seen it in any catalog or index. The library was meticulously organized, and this book didn't belong. Yet, there it was. Evan's heart beat a little faster as he opened the cover, revealing the first page. There were no words written on it, just a single sentence: "You shouldn't have come here." Evan froze. He scanned the page, his mind racing, unsure of what he had just read. The words were hauntingly familiar, yet completely foreign, as though they had been planted in his brain the moment he touched the book. He turned the page, and again, there were no words, only another sentence, scrawled in the same elegant yet unsettling handwriting: "It knows you." He felt a chill crawl down his spine as his eyes locked onto the next line, which wasn't written on paper, but in the air itself, hanging there like a taunt, a whisper made visible: "You shouldn't be here." Evan slammed the book shut, the noise reverberating throughout the quiet library. He stood there, breathing heavily, heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this book was normal. He had to leave. He needed to put it back, pretend this had never happened. But as he turned to walk away, something strange happened. The lights above flickered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The shadows in the corners of the library grew longer, stretching unnaturally toward him. And the air itself began to thicken, as though it were alive, pressing in from all sides. From somewhere in the distance, barely perceptible, he heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, but unmistakable. Evan. His blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it was a voice that seemed to know him, know his every thought, his every fear. The whispering grew louder, insistent, crawling into his mind like an infestation. And the worst part was, it came from everywhere. It was as if the books themselves were whispering, or worse, the library was whispering. Evan. Evan staggered backward, his hands still clutching the cursed book. His breath quickened, and his pulse raced. The library had always been a sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the world. But now, it felt like a trap. Like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him. The shadows were moving closer, creeping toward him like dark, twisted fingers. Evan, the voice was clearer now, more distinct, and it was coming from directly behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Just the rows and rows of books, their covers staring back at him like eyes. The whispering didn't stop. In fact, it intensified, swirling around him in a chaotic frenzy. He could feel it pressing against his mind, digging into his thoughts, unearthing things he didn't want to remember. The scent of decay filled the air, mingling with the musty smell of the books and the cold, oppressive silence of the library. Something was wrong. This wasn't a normal library. And that book, it was somehow at the center of it all. He looked down at it, still in his hands, feeling its weight pressing against him. It was warm now, uncomfortably so. He opened it again, but this time, there were no sentences. Just a single word, run. Without thinking, Evan turned and ran. The library seemed to stretch out before him, an endless maze of corridors and aisles. He couldn't see the exit, couldn't find his way out. The whispering followed him, louder now, a chorus of voices rising in pitch, crawling into his head like worms. He reached the nearest exit, his hand grasping for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he yanked harder, but it was as if the door had fused with the wall, holding him inside. "You can't leave," the voice whispered. "Not until you know." And then, the lights went out. The world around him plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from the faint glow of the book in his hand. It pulsed, each beat sending waves of cold shivers down his spine. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it was all he could hear. His heart raced, and he stumbled backward, only to feel his foot catch on something and send him crashing to the floor. The book slipped from his hand, landing open on the floor. In the faint glow, he saw the words written inside. "It sees you." A figure appeared from the shadows, its form slowly taking shape. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. The figure was staring directly at him. And then, the whispering stopped. There was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that pressed against his ears. The figure took a step toward him, its feet making no sound. Its face was now visible, but it wasn't a face at all, just a gaping void, an endless black hole. "You should never have come here," it said, its voice low and cold. And then, the library was silent. Evan's eyes snapped open. The first thing he noticed was the light. It was warm, natural sunlight, streaming through the tall windows of the library. The smell of old wood and paper filled the air. He was back at the table where he had been sitting earlier, just before the book had drawn him into its dark embrace. He sat up slowly, disoriented. His heart was still racing, his breath shallow. Had it all been a dream? He looked around the library, scanning the familiar surroundings. The quiet hum of the place was reassuring. This was where he belonged. Yet something felt off. He glanced at the book. It was lying there on the table, open. But this time, the pages were blank. He stared at the empty pages for a moment, his mind still foggy, trying to piece together what had happened. His fingers brushed over the smooth surface, but it was different now. The book wasn't warm anymore. It wasn't pulsing. Still, something gnawed at him, a growing sense of dread that wrapped around him like a heavy fog. The whispering, the darkness, the figure. None of it had seemed real, yet it felt like it had happened. The experience was too vivid, too clear in his mind. His heart sank as he realized that even though the book was calm, the fear hadn't gone away. Something had changed. He couldn't explain it, but he knew it deep in his bones. The library had always been a quiet refuge, but now it felt like a cage. The door to the library creaked open, and a woman stepped in. She was tall, with dark hair and a slight frown on her face. It was his classmate, Maria. She had always seemed distant, but he'd never thought much of it. "Hey, Evan. You're here late again, huh?" she said casually, walking past him to the nearby shelf. "I swear, you spend more time in this place than anyone I know." Evan felt a twinge of discomfort as she spoke, as if something was wrong. The words sounded off, like she was just going through the motions of normal conversation. She didn't even glance at him as she began browsing the shelves. "Yeah, just trying to finish some work," Evan replied, his voice strained. He didn't want to admit that he felt like a stranger in this place, even though he had spent countless hours here before. Maria's back was still to him, but she stopped suddenly, her body stiffening. I see you found it," she said softly, her voice trailing off, almost as if she were talking to herself. Evan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Maria didn't turn to face him. Instead, she reached for a book on the shelf, her hand trembling slightly. She pulled it from the shelf and held it in her hands, the book glowing faintly in the dim light. It was the same book, the one Evan had touched earlier. His breath hitched. "No," he whispered. "How do you know about that?" She finally turned to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with something resembling fear. "It's not supposed to be here, Evan," she said, her voice cracking. "No one is supposed to find it." Evan stood, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The air in the library grew colder, the temperature dropping suddenly as if the very building itself was reacting to the presence of the book. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What is this place? Why does it feel like it's alive?" Maria's gaze dropped to the book in her hands, and she clenched it tightly, as if trying to keep it from slipping away. Her fingers shook as she spoke. "I've been in this library for years, Evan. I've seen things, heard things, but nothing like this." She paused for a moment, gathering her courage. "I found it too," she whispered. "A year ago. Just like you. And since then, it's been nothing but a nightmare." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. "Nightmare? What do you mean?" Maria took a deep breath, her eyes darting around the room as if to make sure no one else was listening. "It's not just a book, Evan. It's a curse. A doorway. And once you open it, Once you let it in, it changes everything. She stepped toward him, her face full of dread. It talks to you, doesn't it? It whispers in your mind, pulling you deeper into something you can't escape. He nodded, his throat tight. Yes. It wants something from me. And now, I feel like I can't leave. Like I'm trapped here. In this place. Maria's expression softened, but there was no warmth in it. Only pity. You're not the first person to fall into its grip, she said quietly. And you won't be the last. Her voice trembled as she continued. The library is cursed, Evan. The books, the walls, they know you. They feed on your thoughts, your fears. And once you start reading, once you let the story take root, it's over. Evan's mind raced. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the more Maria spoke, the more he realized that it wasn't just in his mind. Something dark, something alive was lurking in the depths of the library, and it was feeding on him, on his very soul. But I don't understand, he muttered, struggling to keep his thoughts straight. Why does it happen? Why the book? Maria swallowed hard, as though the answer was one she had tried to forget, but knew she could never escape. Because knowledge comes at a price, she whispered. The more you know, the more you lose. The more you understand, the less you become. Evan's mind whirled. What happens to you? To us? Maria looked away, her eyes distant. You forget, she said softly. You forget everything you ever cared about. You forget who you are, and you become part of the library. A voice. A whisper. Lost to time. To the pages. Evan took a step back, his pulse quickening. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape this nightmare. But his feet wouldn't move. The whispers in his mind, the darkness in the corners of the room, all of it had grown stronger, more suffocating. He could feel the air thickening, pressing on him like the weight of 1,000 books. Maria's words echoed in his ears. The more you know, the more you lose. Do you understand now? She asked, her voice low, filled with a hollow sadness. You have to leave. Before it takes you to. But it was too late. Evan had already opened the door. The whispers, the book, the library, they were now part of him. He could feel the pull of the pages, the call of the stories written within them. And he knew, deep down, that he was already lost. The library was no longer just a place to study. It was a prison. A twisted, living thing that fed on his every thought, every fear. It knew him. It knew his secrets, his desires, and now it was using them to hold him in its grasp. The shadows seemed to deepen, closing in around him, and he realized, with a sickening jolt, that Maria was no longer standing in front of him. She had vanished. Just like the others. Just like everyone who had ever fallen prey to the library. The book began to whisper again. Evan's hands shook as he reached for it. And this time, there was no turning back. Evan's hand trembled as he reached for the cursed book. His fingers brushed over the leather-bound cover, and the moment they made contact, an electric pulse shot up his arm, leaving him with a sick feeling in his stomach. The whispers grew louder, vibrating through the pages, curling around his mind like smoke, suffocating him. You cannot escape. The words, barely audible, slithered into his ears, and the weight of them pressed down on him, nearly crushing him. The library, the room, felt even darker now, the walls pressing closer as if the very space was shrinking, drawing him deeper into its web. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment he considered putting the book down and running from this place, from the library, from everything that was happening. But the whispers had already seeped into him. There was no turning back. There never had been. The more you read, the more you know, the less you become. Evan clenched his jaw, trying to push the voice out of his mind, but it lingered. It followed him. The room felt alive now, not just the books, but the very space around him. Shadows stretched along across the floor, curling and twisting like tendrils of darkness. The once comforting silence of the library had turned into an oppressive, suffocating presence, pressing against him from all sides. The flickering overhead lights cast eerie, shifting patterns on the walls, but no matter where he looked, the shadows seemed to grow, to move. Evan snapped the book shut, but the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, more insistent, more demanding. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with a presence that wasn't quite human. He turned, but the library seemed endless, the aisles stretching on forever, each one darker and more claustrophobic than the last. His breath quickened, his pulse racing in his ears as he stumbled down the aisles, desperately trying to escape the suffocating pressure of the space around him. But there was no escape. Not anymore. Every corner of the library now felt like a trap, every turn a dead end. No matter which aisle he ran down, the shelves seemed to grow taller, the books more oppressive, their weight on his mind growing heavier with each passing moment. The whispers surrounded him, drowning out all other sound, filling him with a sense of dread that seemed to come from within him, not without. You are lost. The words echoed inside his skull, louder than ever. He gritted his teeth, trying to push them out, but it was like the air itself was thick with them. With each breath, they sank deeper into his mind, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, slowly consuming him. His vision blurred, his head spinning. The edges of the room seemed to distort, the walls twisting, bending unnaturally. He tried to focus, tried to ground himself in reality. This is just a dream, just a nightmare, he told himself. I can wake up. I have to wake up. But nothing changed. The whispers continued, the darkness deepened, and the feeling that the very space was alive intensified. He stumbled forward, unable to see clearly now, but he knew the library was endless. There was no way out. There was no escape from this place. He closed his eyes, but the images persisted, burned into his mind, memories, faces, voices, flashes of a life he no longer recognized. But the faces weren't his own. They were people, no, they were stories, trapped within the books. The library was feeding on him, feeding on his mind. It was then that he saw it. At the far end of the library, just as he turned a corner, there was a figure standing by one of the shelves. A silhouette. Tall. Thin. Its face obscured by shadows. Evan's heart skipped a beat, his body frozen in place. The figure didn't move, but he felt its presence, its eyes boring into him, even though he couldn't see its face. The air grew colder as he took a hesitant step forward, and he could feel something else lurking just beyond the figure. Something waiting. Who are you? Evan's voice shook as he spoke. the words barely leaving his mouth. His throat was dry, his mouth parched. The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. The silence between them stretched, oppressive, suffocating. Evan's mind raced. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The whispers were louder now, circling around him like vultures. He forced himself to take another step, his pulse quickening, his breathing shallow. He couldn't look away from the figure. And then, the figure moved. Slowly. Too slowly. The shadows shifted as it stepped forward, revealing the face beneath the darkness. But the face wasn't a face at all. It was a void, an empty, black space where a face should have been. The void shifted, contorted, like something breathing, alive, but devoid of life. The air grew colder, and Evan's breath came out in ragged gasps. It spoke, its voice like a whisper in his mind, inescapable. You should not have read the book. The library knows you. It knows everything about you. Everything you have ever feared. And now, it will take you. No, Evan whispered, backing away. I didn't, this isn't. But the figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its voice reverberating in his skull. The books were never meant to be opened. The stories, they are not just words. They are memories. They are lives. And now, you've taken them. And they will take you. Evan's eyes darted around, but there was no escape. The walls seemed to bend and shift, the air thickening with the weight of the presence before him. He had known this was coming. Deep down, he had always known. The library was no longer just a place. It was alive. It had always been alive. And it had been waiting for him. The shadows seemed to close in on him, suffocating, pressing down on him until he couldn't breathe. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, the whispers louder now, a cacophony of voices filling his mind. He could feel them pulling him in, consuming him. But he couldn't stop. The book was still in his hands. He could still hear its whispers, its promises, its demands. It knows you, they said. The floor beneath him trembled, and the air around him thickened with the sound of turning pages. And then, a single line of text appeared in front of his eyes, scrawled in the air, like ink on paper. You belong here now. A deep, bone-chilling cold washed over him, and for the briefest of moments, the whispers stopped. The shadows parted, and the figure moved away, leaving Evan alone in the middle of the library. But the room had changed. The bookshelves had closed in on him, the aisles now narrow, claustrophobic. The walls were no longer empty. They were covered in strange symbols, in writing Evan could not comprehend. The space itself was warping. He could feel it. He was no longer just in a library. He was in the story. He had become part of it. He closed his eyes. The darkness surrounded him, swallowing him whole. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The library had always known him. Every fear, every secret, every shadow in his mind, it was all there, in the books. And now, there was no way out. The last whisper echoed in his mind, louder than ever before. You are part of the story now. As the darkness consumed him, Evan understood. He wasn't just a reader anymore. He was written. And as the whispers grew louder, He knew, with terrifying certainty, that the library would never let him go. Evan stood at the center of the library, his surroundings now a twisted labyrinth of endless shelves and flickering lights. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, and the air felt thick with something ancient. The whispers, those maddening whispers, had returned, but now they weren't just voices. They were memories. They were his memories. His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached up to wipe the sweat from his brow. His fingers brushed against the dusty spines of the books that surrounded him, each one seemingly alive, its pages filled with stories he had never written, but somehow knew intimately. The names, the faces, they were his. Yet, they weren't. The room had changed. The library, once a comforting refuge, now seemed to hold a dark, sinister energy. He could feel it pressing on him, suffocating him. It was as though the books themselves were watching him, judging him. Each step he took seemed to echo in the stillness, the sound of his footsteps amplified by the thick, oppressive silence. Evan's breath came in shallow gasps. He didn't know how long he had been there. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time no longer seemed to make sense. All he knew was that the longer he stayed in this place, the more the lines between reality and the books blurred. His mind felt fuzzy, like the edges of his thoughts were slipping away. He reached for a book on the shelf. It wasn't one he remembered seeing before, and yet, as his fingers brushed its cover, he felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity. He pulled it out, the cover crackling with age as he opened it. The first page was blank, but the second page held a single line of text. "You can't escape this story." The words hit him like a physical blow. The whispers grew louder, now mixed with the steady thrum of his heart. He slammed the book shut, but the words seemed to echo in his mind, reverberating off the walls of the library, swirling around him like a storm. "You can't escape." Evan's chest tightened. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the library was changing. The shelves were shifting, rearranging themselves, and he realized with sickening clarity that there was no exit. The walls were moving in on him, slowly but deliberately, as though the library itself were tightening its grip. His head spun. His vision blurred. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him. The whispers were everywhere, filling his mind, drowning him in their incessant murmurs. "You know too much." The words had no meaning anymore. They were just fragments of a story that had already been written, and Evan was a part of it. Evan stumbled backward, his feet tripping over the uneven floorboards. His breathing was ragged, the air around him thick with the stench of decay. He reached out to steady himself, but his hand met only cold, empty air. The library had transformed completely. What had once been a grand and comforting space was now a prison. The shelves had morphed into walls, the light flickering like dying embers, casting shadows that danced and twisted in unnatural ways. It was as though the very space around him had turned against him, closing in, trapping him. In the distance, he saw it, another figure. A silhouette. A shadow. It was standing in front of one of the bookshelves, motionless. For a moment, Evan thought it was just another illusion, another figment of his fractured mind. But as he took a step forward, it moved. It was the same figure he had seen before, the one with the empty, gaping face. The figure that had spoken to him in the darkness. the figure that had told him there was no way out. It was closer now, standing only a few feet away. Its presence was suffocating, its void-like face staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You wanted to know, Evan," the figure said, its voice hollow, like a whisper from the depths of the earth. "Now you will know everything." Evan's mind reeled. He couldn't understand. What did it mean? What was it going to do to him? The figure took a step forward, and Evan instinctively took a step back. But the figure was faster. It closed the distance between them in an instant, its hand reaching out toward him. The shadows around it seemed to bend and shift, and Evan's stomach twisted in fear. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his chest constricted. The figure's hand wrapped around his arm, its grip cold and unyielding. "It is too late for you," the figure said, its voice now deep and resonating, as though it were speaking from everywhere at once. "You have read the book. You have entered the story. And now you are part of it." Evan's mind screamed for release, for escape, but there was no way out. The library had swallowed him whole. It had claimed him, body and soul. The figure pulled him forward, and the walls of the library seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, and Evan could feel the pressure building, crushing him from all sides. He tried to fight, but his body felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel. And then the whisper stopped. Evan looked around in confusion. The library, the figure, it was all gone. He was standing in an empty void, the darkness stretching on forever. He could hear nothing now, only the deafening silence. The book, the cursed book, appeared in his hands once more. He looked down at it, and the words on the cover glowed faintly, a faint, sickly light. "The final page is yours." He opened the book, and the words began to appear on the pages, written in the same dark ink. The text seemed to bleed out of the paper, curling into shapes that made his skin crawl. It was his story, his life, written out before him. But it wasn't just his life. It was everyone's life. Every person he had ever known, every detail, every fear, every secret, was written there, as though he had lived their lives, too. The line between his own memories and the memories of others blurred. The last page of the book was blank. But as Evan stared at it, he realized that he knew what was written there. He closed the book, but the words remained. He was part of the story. Forever. Evan understood now. There was no escape. The library had consumed him. It would continue to consume him long after his body had disappeared into its dark, twisted corridors. "You are the story," the figure had said. And now, Evan was the whisper. The darkness consumed him. The shadows twisted, and the air grew cold once more. And as he faded into the pages, the final whisper echoed in his mind. The story never ends. Story 5. The cemetery stretched out in front of George Wheeler like a sea of stone, rows and rows of weathered gravestones and marble slabs. The place was peaceful, or at least it used to be. For years, George had worked as the caretaker of the Whitlock Cemetery, a quiet job where the days bled together in slow, predictable rhythms. It was a job that suited him. The constant solitude gave him time to think, to reflect, to find comfort in the stillness of it all. Every morning, George would walk through the graveyard with his clipboard, checking off the various tasks, trimming the grass around the gravestones, patching up cracks in the paths, keeping the mausoleum secure. It was a simple existence. He never minded it. The weathered stones had stories, but George didn't ask too many questions. He was just there to tend to the place. But lately, something had begun to unsettle him. Each night, as he locked the cemetery gates and walked back to his small house on the edge of the grounds, a strange feeling hung in the air. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was as though the cemetery itself was waiting for something. Or perhaps it was just his own mind playing tricks on him after years of working in the stillness. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that George first noticed something truly strange. One of the graves, just one, seemed to shift position every night. He chalked it up to his imagination at first. After all, the cemetery was old, and the soil shifted over time. But as the days passed, the unease grew. The grave in question was at the far end of the cemetery, by the old oak tree that seemed to cast a perpetual shadow over the ground. George had always avoided it. Something about the spot made his skin crawl. It was an old grave, one of the oldest in the cemetery. The name on the stone had long since worn away, leaving only a faint outline of where the letters used to be. And yet, every morning, the earth over that grave would look different. The headstone wasn't aligned as it had been the day before. The ground would be disturbed, as if someone had been digging. But George knew that was impossible. No one else had been there. He had the only key to the gates. There was no one else to disturb the dead. It started with small changes, the stone leaning a little to the left, the ground around it appearing slightly more uneven than it should. But as days passed, the changes grew more noticeable. The grave was becoming more and more misaligned with the others. One morning, George had stood at the gate, watching as the sun rose over the cemetery. The first rays of light painted the gravestones in an eerie, golden glow. His eyes were drawn again to the grave in question. Something was off. The headstone had shifted, yes, but it wasn't just the angle that was wrong. It was the way it felt. The air around it felt alive, if that made sense. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he stared at it. Something in the back of his mind screamed at him to go over there, to investigate. But another part of him, one that had been built over years of experience, urged him to stay away. That night, George couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, the uneasy feeling gnawing at his insides. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the cemetery, making sure to stay out of sight of his small house. As he walked past the rows of gravestones, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path, his eyes were drawn to the grave again. He couldn't help himself. He had to know if the strange feeling was real or if he was just imagining things. He reached the spot, his breath catching in his throat as he shone the flashlight on the headstone. It was crooked, tilted to one side, just as it had been before. But this time, the earth around it was freshly disturbed, as if something or someone had been digging. He knelt down, shining the light into the small hole forming beneath the stone. His heart raced as he stared at the loose soil. The air felt thick with tension, and it was as if the grave itself was watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the earth beneath him shifted. It was so subtle at first that George almost didn't notice it. But then, the ground began to shake ever so slightly, like something was moving underneath it. A gust of cold wind whipped through the cemetery, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. George stood up quickly, the flashlight shaking in his hand. His mind raced. What was happening? This was impossible. And then, the whisper came. The sound was faint at first, barely more than a breeze passing through the trees. But it grew louder, and as it did, it became more distinct. It was a voice, low, guttural, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me. George froze. His heart stopped in his chest. The voice seemed to come from directly beneath the ground. The earth rumbled again, this time stronger, as though something was trying to force its way up from below. Who's there? George called out, his voice shaky, a knot of fear rising in his throat. There was no answer, only the increasing tremor in the ground and that damn whisper, growing louder, more insistent. He shined the flashlight into the hole, but there was nothing there. No movement. No body. Just earth and shadows. The wind picked up again, howling through the cemetery, rattling the nearby trees. But the whisper wouldn't stop. Help me. Help me, please. His legs felt like lead. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound was so close now, so real, like someone was standing right next to him. The whispers, they were coming from the grave. From the earth itself. He couldn't take it anymore. Panic seized him, and he ran. His footsteps pounded against the gravel, each one louder than the last, as if the ground itself were chasing him. The cemetery seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, the graveyard now a twisted maze of shadows. As he reached the gate, he looked back one last time. The ground around the grave was still trembling, but the whispers had stopped. The grave itself, now eerily still, felt like it was waiting for something or someone to come back. George spent the following day in a haze, unable to shake the feeling of dread that clung to him like an unshakable fog. He tried to go about his usual routine, tending to the graves, trimming the overgrown grass, and cleaning up the litter that accumulated over the weekends. But no matter what he did, his mind kept drifting back to the grave at the far corner of the cemetery, the one that moved. It was ridiculous, he knew. Graves didn't move. People didn't whisper from beneath the earth. It was just a trick of the mind, a dark hallucination brought on by years of isolation and stress. But deep down, a voice inside him couldn't deny the truth of what he had heard. By the time evening rolled around, the unease had only grown. He found himself pacing in his small cottage, trying to distract himself from the thought of that cursed grave. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the shadows in his cottage grew longer, creeping closer with each passing minute. He couldn't stay inside. The air was too thick, and his own thoughts were suffocating him. The whispers haunted him, clinging to the edges of his mind like cobwebs. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, pulling it shut behind him. As he walked toward the cemetery, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. The grave, he couldn't stop thinking about it. What if the whispers hadn't been a figment of his imagination? What if something was down there? The cemetery loomed in front of him, shrouded in darkness. The moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the gravestones cast long, eerie shadows across the ground. The air felt still, almost suffocating, and the wind had died down, leaving an unnatural silence that weighed on him like a physical force. When he reached the far corner, he stopped. There it was. the grave. But now, it was different. The headstone was askew, more so than it had been before. The earth around it was disturbed, as if something, or someone, had been digging. George swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt a familiar knot of fear twist in his stomach, but he forced himself forward. He had to know. He couldn't let this consume him any longer. George knelt beside the grave, shining his flashlight on the disturbed earth. The grave was deeper than it had been before, the hole now large enough to expose the bottom of the coffin. His pulse quickened as he leaned in, the beam of light flickering in the shifting shadows. The whispers were back, faint, like the wind whispering through the trees, but unmistakable. They were there, rising from the earth itself. "Help me," the voice rasped again, low and strained, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the ground. George's heart raced. Sweat beat on his forehead despite the cold night air. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Who's there?" His voice came out hoarse, cracking with fear. "What do you want?" The whispers didn't respond. But they were louder now, and more urgent. He felt the ground beneath him shift again, this time with more force. His eyes widened as he backed away, feeling the tremor run through the earth like a pulse. The ground seemed alive, as though it were moving of its own accord. The shadows around him stretched, bending and shifting unnaturally. The air felt thick with the presence of something malevolent, something ancient. "Help me. It's not too late." The voice was clearer now, more distinct. "Who are you?" George asked again, his voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer, just the creaking of the earth beneath him. He shone the flashlight into the hole, but all he saw was darkness. Then, something large, shifted beneath the surface. The earth moved again, but this time it was not a tremor. It was a motion. A large hand, if it could be called that, shot up from the grave, its fingers gnarled and twisted, pulling itself from the soil as if emerging from the very depths of hell. George stumbled back, his heart thundering in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, panic rising in his throat as he watched the hand push upward, the rest of the figure slowly coming into view. It was skeletal, its limbs thin and cracked, its skin a sickly gray. Its eyes, empty, hollow sockets, locked onto him with an unnatural intensity, a gaze that seemed to pierce straight into his soul. "I've waited for so long," the voice rasped, as the figure dragged itself out of the grave, the earth giving way beneath it. George couldn't move. Fear had rooted him in place, his feet frozen to the ground as the figure rose fully from the grave. It was taller than him, its form gaunt and twisted, its bones creaking with every movement. The figure's mouth opened, but it wasn't a human voice that came out. It was a chorus, multiple voices, all speaking at once, a cacophony of anguish and desperation. "Help us. Help me. It's not too late. You've disturbed the grave. Now, you are ours." George's chest tightened. The words didn't make sense, but they didn't need to. The figure in front of him, the one emerging from the earth, wasn't just a man. It wasn't just a corpse. It was something older, something far more ancient than anything he had ever imagined. And it was hungry. George staggered backward, his mind racing. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs felt like lead. The figure, The thing from the grave continued to move toward him, dragging its skeletal form through the dirt, its hollow eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, unfeeling, like the wind howling through an abandoned house. "You've disturbed the peace of the grave. You've awoken us." The ground around the grave continued to shift, and George realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just the one figure that was coming. There were others beneath the ground, their hands now reaching up, their bodies slowly emerging from the earth, their movements jerky and unnatural. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't be part of this nightmare. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the gravel path as he fled from the grave, from the cemetery, from the growing darkness that had claimed this place. His breath came in ragged gasps as the wind whipped around him, tearing at his clothes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The voices chased him. The whispers. The figures. "You cannot run. The grave is your fate." But as he reached the gates, he looked back one final time. The grave, the figure, the voices, they were all gone. The cemetery stood still once again, as though nothing had ever happened. But George knew. It wasn't over. Not yet. The grave would shift again. And next time, it wouldn't be him running. George couldn't shake the images of that night, the figure, the voices, the way the earth had seemed to breathe. He was back in his small cottage now, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The sun had barely risen, but the shadows in his mind seemed to stretch longer, more oppressive. For 2 days, he had been unable to sleep, his mind replaying the events in the cemetery like an unrelenting film. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the window, sent his heart into a panic. The whispers followed him, lingering just at the edge of his thoughts. He'd told himself he would leave, that he would pack up and get as far away from Woodlock Cemetery as possible. The grave, the whispers, they didn't belong to him. But every time he tried to get up, someone, kept pulling him back. The urge to return to the cemetery was like a compulsion, a force he couldn't explain. George found himself standing at the window, looking out at the cemetery. It was still there, just across the way. The same old rows of gravestones, the same unassuming cemetery. Nothing appeared to be different, but in the pit of his stomach, he knew that things had changed. The grave that moved, the one he couldn't shake from his mind, was still there, waiting. He felt a deep unease settle in his chest, a feeling that this wasn't just some wild hallucination, that the forces at play were far beyond his understanding. And so, against his better judgment, he put on his coat and walked out the door. The cemetery was eerily quiet as George made his way past the rows of gravestones. The sun had set, casting long shadows over the paths. The wind had picked up again, though it wasn't the usual breeze that stirred the trees. It felt colder, heavier, as though something was moving just out of sight. When he reached the far corner of the cemetery, he hesitated. The grave was still there, its headstone crooked, and the earth around it was freshly disturbed, as if it had been touched again. George swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for the flashlight in his pocket. "What are you?" he whispered to himself. He didn't want to know, but his body carried him forward, as if some unseen force was pushing him closer. The faint whispering that had haunted him since that night stirred again in the back of his mind. It was louder now, more insistent. He shone the light on the grave, but the beam of the flashlight flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows over the disturbed earth. George crouched down, heart racing, as he examined the ground. And that's when he saw it. There, beneath the surface of the soil, something was shifting. The earth bulged and shifted as though something, or someone, was moving underneath. A low, guttural groan came from deep within the grave, the sound like the rasping breath of a dying creature. The whispers grew louder. "You shouldn't have come." George's heart pounded in his chest. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was unmistakable, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, and it was coming from the grave. "No," George muttered, stepping back. He couldn't breathe. The cold grip of fear wrapped around his throat, choking him. The earth trembled beneath his feet. He took another step back, his eyes wide with terror. And then he saw it. A hand, white and skeletal, shot up from the grave, its fingers clawing at the dirt as if trying to escape its burial. The hand was followed by another and another. The ground erupted, and the figure, twisted, gaunt, and broken, pulled itself out of the earth, its hollow eyes locking onto him. "It's too late," it rasped. "You've disturbed us. You've awakened us all." George's knees buckled as he stumbled backward. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. He could feel the weight of the figure's presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. The other hands were emerging now, clawing their way through the soil like some hellish army. They were reaching for him. He turned and ran, but his legs refused to move fast enough. His feet stumbled on the uneven ground, and the whispers filled his ears, drowning out everything else. "You can't escape. You're one of us now." George reached the cemetery gate, his chest heaving as he fumbled with the lock. His heart was a hammer in his chest, his breath ragged from fear. He could hear the shuffling of feet behind him, the sounds of something or someone growing closer. But when he turned, the cemetery was empty. There was no one there. Just the stillness of the graves, the whispers that had now faded into a soft hum. He felt disoriented, confused. Had it all been a nightmare? The grave, the whispers, the thing that had risen from the earth. Had he imagined it? But no! The earth was still disturbed. The grave was still open. George ran out of the cemetery and didn't look back. He didn't stop until he reached his cottage, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against it, hands shaking, his mind racing. But as the cold sweat began to cool on his skin, he heard it again. The whispering. It was coming from inside the house. No, not from inside. It was coming from the walls. The whispers were seeping through the walls, filling the air with their maddening sound. George stumbled backward into the dark, heart pounding in his ears. He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to block out the noise, but it only grew louder, more insistent. "You can never leave. You are one of us now." The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned. The darkness seemed to stretch, to expand, as if the house itself were alive. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though something was pressing on him from all sides. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. But the feeling lingered. The feeling that the grave, the thing beneath the earth, was still there, still waiting. And it was coming for him. As the night wore on, George's mind began to unravel. His thoughts spiraled in every direction, each one leading back to that grave, that cursed grave that he could never escape. He paced around his cottage, the walls feeling as if they were closing in on him. The whispers were gone, but they had left their mark. His eyes darted nervously from corner to corner, as if expecting the figures to appear again. The silence now felt unnatural, suffocating. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the corner of the room. George froze, his heart stopping in his chest. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he slowly turned to face the sound. The wall was bulging. A dark shape pressed against the plaster, as though something beneath it was pushing its way through. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The truth dawned on him, the full weight of it crashing down. The grave had never been about the dead, it was about what had been buried there. What had been waiting. And it had found him. It had found its way into his life, into his mind. The whispers had been more than just voices. They were warnings. But it was too late. The grave that moved, he was part of it now. Forever. The wall cracked open, and through the darkness, something reached out, a skeletal hand, clawing its way to freedom. George could only stare in horror as the wall cracked open, the sound of splintering plaster filling the room. A pale, bony hand reached through the gap, its fingers grasping desperately at the air. The house seemed to groan with an unnatural tension, as if it were alive, its very foundations quaking under the weight of whatever had been trapped inside it. The hand, cold and skeletal, clutched the broken wall as the figure behind it began to emerge. George's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment his mind seemed to freeze, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He took a step backward, his legs shaky, his body reacting against his will. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like the very atmosphere was being suffocated by the presence in the room. The figure's head emerged next, twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into him, into his very soul. It was the same creature from the grave, the one that had emerged from the earth with its twisted limbs, its skeletal form. But now it was inside his house, and George could feel its cold presence permeating the air. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its hollow gaze told George everything he needed to know. It had come for him, just as it had whispered from the grave. "You are one of us now." The truth hit George like a brick. It wasn't just the grave, it was the land, the very soil. Whatever had been buried there had been waiting, and now that it had found him, there was no escape. The creature was not alone. It had brought others with it. Their clawed hands reached out from the cracks in the walls, emerging from the shadows. "Help me," the voices came, not from one, but from many. They filled the room, echoing off the walls, overlapping in a cacophony of agony and despair. The creature stepped forward, its cold, brittle skin scraping against the floorboards as it moved. George could feel it watching him, its hollow eyes searing through him. His body froze, paralyzed by fear as the whispers surrounded him. Each voice was louder now, each one more insistent. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have disturbed us." George's mind raced. The cemetery, the grave, had been the key all along. The land wasn't just cursed, it was a prison, a tomb for these things that had been buried long ago. The whispers had followed him, first in the cemetery, then into his home. And now they were here, inside his mind, inside his world. He could feel it, deep within him. The pull, the undeniable force that was dragging him into the darkness. The grave had moved, and now it had come for him. The creature reached out, its fingers brushing against George's face. He flinched, but the cold touch held him still. The other figures continued to crawl from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The walls closed in, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. George fought to break free from their gaze, but his body betrayed him. His legs felt like lead, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He couldn't escape. There was no escape. "You cannot run," the creature whispered, its voice an amalgamation of the countless others that had followed it from the grave. "We are part of you now. You will never leave." The weight of the words crushed him, the terror settling into his bones. He tried to speak, to scream, but his voice was nothing more than a weak rasp. The darkness that had settled in the room now seemed to seep into his soul, suffocating any hope he had left. The whispers filled his mind, tearing at his sanity, urging him to listen, to join them. "We are many. You are one." George's mind spun in circles as the realization sank in. He was trapped. The grave, the whispers, the earth itself had swallowed him whole. There was no escaping the curse of the land, no escaping the figures that now surrounded him. His body trembled, and for a moment he felt like he was drowning in the suffocating presence of the creatures. But then, something inside him snapped. The whispers, those voices, had been with him for so long, pulling at the edges of his mind. He had been running from them, from the grave, from the terror that clung to him like a shadow. But it wasn't just the grave that had been waiting for him. It was the curse that had followed him all his life, a curse that had been planted deep in the soil, in the very air he breathed. He had been chosen. He had been marked. And now, there was no turning back. The creature reached out again, its skeletal hand hovering inches from his face. George closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to make a choice. "Join us," the creature whispered, its voice cold and final. "There is no other way." George felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could fight, he could run, but there was nowhere left to go. The grave had moved. The curse had taken root in him. And then, with a surge of clarity, he understood. The grave wasn't just a place. It was a force. And that force had been waiting for him. With a final, breathless cry, George stepped into the darkness, letting the creature's cold hands take him. The air was thick with the sound of the whispers, filling the room as the creature's grip tightened. George felt his body surrender, his mind slipping away. The darkness consumed him, just as it had consumed the others before him. There was no escape. The creatures in the shadows faded, their forms retreating back into the depths of the house, and the whispers grew fainter. The walls settled, the air cleared, but the weight of the grave, of the curse, still lingered in the air. And in the silence that followed, the ground beneath the cemetery shifted once more. Story 6. Ethan had been coming to the platform for nearly 2 months now. Every evening, he would stand by the tracks, waiting for the train that always seemed to be just out of reach. The commuters around him would come and go, their lives humming with the busy rhythm of the world, but for Ethan, it had become a ritual. A waiting game. Something he could no longer explain, but also couldn't stop. The station itself was nothing extraordinary. Old concrete floors that cracked underfoot, the faint smell of oil and exhaust in the air, the flickering overhead lights that made the shadows stretch unnaturally long. But there was something about it that gnawed at him, something hidden just beneath the surface. Most nights, he arrived at 6:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled train, but no matter how many times he showed up, the train never arrived. Not a single sound of the wheels on the track, no screeching of metal on metal. The only thing that ever came was the endless silence that hung in the air like an invisible weight, suffocating him in its stillness. Ethan wasn't sure why he kept coming back. There was no rational explanation, no reasonable cause. Maybe it was the promise of something more, something just out of sight, just beyond the horizon. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth. The train would never come. It wasn't a part of the world he knew, yet somehow, it felt like it had become part of him. Another night, another wasted wait, he muttered to himself, half smiling in the fading light. The commuters that passed him barely spared him a glance, too caught up in their own lives, their own worlds. Ethan envied them in a way. Their certainty, their movement, their destination. He felt rooted in place, a shadow among shadows, waiting for something that would never arrive. He checked his watch. 7:05 p.m. The station was empty now, except for him. The cold breeze stirred through the platform, and the sound of it seemed to carry with it something else, something more sinister. He looked at the tracks, the darkened tunnels beyond them, and couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The first time he heard the whisper, he didn't know what to think. At first, it was so soft, so faint, that he thought it was the wind. But as the minutes dragged on, the whisper grew clearer, more defined. It wasn't coming from the direction of the tracks, but from somewhere within the station itself. The voices around him had disappeared, leaving only the oppressive silence and that soft, eerie murmur. He turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the platform was empty. No one. Just the sound of his own breath and the whisper that seemed to curl around him like a living thing. The whisper grew louder until it sounded almost like a voice he couldn't quite place. It sounded familiar, but when he tried to focus on it, it slipped away like water through his fingers. "It's coming," the voice barely rose above a breath, a ghostly presence that filled the empty air. He shivered, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He scanned the platform again, his heart racing. Nothing. The station was empty. The whisper had faded, but the tension lingered, thick and heavy in the air. Ethan took a few shaky steps toward the tunnel, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but something inside him told him that he needed to investigate. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't leave until he understood. The tunnel was dark, an endless black hole that stretched into the unknown. He felt a compulsion, an irrational urge to step forward, but his feet remained glued to the spot. The whisper hadn't come from there, he was certain of it, but the sense of something watching him from the depths of the tunnel was undeniable. The platform felt colder now, the air heavy with the promise of something unseen. He checked his watch again. 7:15 p.m. The train would have been here by now. He felt a flicker of doubt in his mind. What if the train had come already? What if he had missed it? The thought twisted in his gut. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but still, he stood frozen. He couldn't look away from the dark tunnel. For some reason, it was pulling him closer and closer to the edge of the platform. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop himself. A sudden screech broke the silence. Ethan whipped around, heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes darted from one side of the platform to the other. Nothing. He felt like a fool. The sound, maybe it was just the old station settling. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the product of too many nights spent waiting for a train that never came. But then he heard it again. A low scraping sound, followed by something that sounded like a breath, gasping and desperate. It wasn't human, not at all. It came from the darkness of the tunnel, deeper now, as if something large was moving down there, something with purpose. Ethan took a hesitant step back, then another. The shadows beyond the platform shifted, as if alive, as though they were crawling toward him. He felt his pulse quicken, his legs trembling beneath him. The air seemed to constrict, pressing in from all sides. He could feel it, something, coming. Something from the tunnel. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The whispering began again. Only this time, it was louder, clearer, and it wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice. A single, harsh whisper that carried through the empty station like a warning. It's too late now. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His breath hitched in his throat, and he spun toward the platform again. There was no one. Nothing. The train hadn't come. But the air felt different now, thick with the promise of something horrible. Something was in the station. Something was watching him. And then, as if the night had been waiting for this moment, a low rumbling sound echoed from the tunnel. The faintest glimmer of light appeared at the far end, and the sound grew louder, like the wheels of a train grinding against the tracks. It was coming. Finally. The train was arriving. But there was something wrong. The light from the tunnel wasn't like any light Ethan had ever seen. It was too bright, too blinding. It pulsed and flickered as though it were alive, its harsh glow casting strange, contorted shadows on the walls. And the train, it wasn't a train. Not in any way he could understand. It was something else. Something ancient. And Ethan was about to step aboard. Ethan stood frozen at the edge of the platform, his eyes wide with disbelief. The train was coming, he could hear it now, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath his feet. But it wasn't the train he expected. The air around him was thick, heavy with an unnatural weight. The flickering lights seemed to stretch, elongating the shadows until they warped and twisted, forming shapes that danced in the periphery of his vision. The train, if it could even be called that, was now visible in the distance. It wasn't a modern train, sleek and polished like the ones he'd seen before. This was something older, something far more ancient. The lights that illuminated its windows were dim and flickering, casting a sickly yellow glow that made the walls of the station feel cold and oppressive. The train wasn't slowing down either, it was coming faster than it should have, hurtling toward him with an unnatural speed. He stepped back, instinctively, his mind telling him to run, to get away, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, as though the platform itself had trapped him. The train's momentum was picking up, its eerie rumble growing louder. He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, each beat sending a tremor through his body. Something wasn't right. Something was deeply wrong, and it wasn't just the train, it was everything around him. The air felt cold and stale, like it hadn't moved in years. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have, growing taller and thinner with each passing second. The station was empty, save for Ethan, and yet the sense of being watched was palpable. He wasn't alone. Something was here with him. The train was almost upon him now, and Ethan felt a sense of dread rise within him. He looked up at the train as it drew closer. The train carriage is now a few feet away, the windows distorted with an almost unnatural sheen. There were no passengers visible inside, only the faintest reflection of a figure standing in the front of the train. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure, who was it? Why couldn't he see them clearly? It was almost as if the figure was not real. It was a shadow, a mirage, something that didn't belong. As the train came to a screeching halt, Ethan was barely able to breathe. The doors to the nearest carriage slid open slowly, the sound of the metal grinding against metal reverberating in his chest. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears, each thudding beat a reminder of how much he wanted to run, how much he needed to escape. But the doors, those doors, seemed to call to him. The whispers, faint but insistent, filled his head again, growing louder this time, pushing their way into his mind like a virus. "Come aboard," they said, their voices muffled but persistent. "Come and see. The train will take you. The train will bring you where you belong." Against his better judgment, Ethan stepped forward. His hand reached for the door, and it opened before he even touched it, an invisible force drawing him in. The platform behind him seemed to vanish, the world outside the train fading into nothingness. Ethan didn't stop to think. He couldn't. He was already too deep, too far gone to turn back. The interior of the train was dimly lit, with shadows lurking in every corner, stretching and warping as though they were alive. The air inside smelled old, like dust and mildew, and there was an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over him as soon as he stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating like the closing of a tomb. He was alone. Or so he thought. The train car was long, stretching endlessly before him, the dim lights flickering overhead. Ethan could feel the vibrations of the train as it moved, though there was no sound of the tracks beneath. The train seemed to glide effortlessly, as if floating, its motion too smooth, too perfect. The car was empty, the seats untouched, the floor spotless. But something was off. The stillness, the absence of people, it felt wrong. The air felt too thick, too heavy. It was as if the train itself was a part of something else, something far darker. Ethan moved deeper into the car, his steps echoing in the silence. The train, it seemed, had no real destination. There was no destination in sight, no stations, no signs. Just the endless stretch of the dark corridor ahead of him. The windows, once clear and unbroken, were now fogged up, as if something was trying to escape from the other side. And then, in the farthest corner of the car, he saw her. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. But as he stepped closer, the figure became clearer. She was sitting alone, her back turned to him, staring out the window. Her hair was dark, long, and disheveled, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind that belonged to a time long past, its edges frayed as though it had been worn for years. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her. He could feel his breath catch in his throat as he stared at her, the way her shoulders slumped, the way she seemed so disconnected from the world around her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling, but it came out in a whisper. Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge him. She simply continued to stare out the window, her expression vacant, as if she were lost in thought, or lost in something else entirely. Ethan took another step closer, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There was something wrong about her, about everything in this train. The longer he stared at her, the more he began to realize that something wasn't quite right. "Hello?" Ethan tried again, but still no response. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed against her skin, her head snapped around, her eyes wide and wild. There was something deeply unsettling about the look she gave him. Her pupils were dilated, her skin unnaturally pale. The whites of her eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, as though they were the only real thing in this whole forsaken place. And then she spoke. "It's too late for you." Ethan recoiled, his heart racing. Her voice, hollow and strained, echoed through his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. The train continued its silent journey, gliding through a place that was neither here nor there. The air around him grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the darkness was closing in. The whispers returned, louder than ever before, their meaning now clear. They were not inviting him. They were warning him. The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, and in that moment, Ethan understood. The train wasn't just a train, it was a path. A path that led nowhere. A path that led to something far worse than death. He tried to move, tried to step away from her, but his feet were frozen to the floor. The train had stopped moving. The car was now suspended in darkness, the world outside the windows nothing but an empty void. "You can't leave," she said again, her voice a whisper in the silence. "This is where you belong now. This is where we all belong." The doors opened behind him, but he couldn't move. He was trapped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. The walls of the train seemed to close in, and Ethan felt himself being pulled toward the doorway. And then he stepped into the darkness. Ethan stumbled into the dark void beyond the train doors, his feet seemingly moving of their own accord. As the cold air wrapped around him, he realized the train car had disappeared entirely. There was no platform, no ground, no sign of where he had been. The darkness around him was all-encompassing, swallowing every trace of light. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow and erratic. Where was he? What was this place? A faint glow appeared ahead of him, flickering like a distant star. He felt himself drawn toward it, instinctively taking one step after another, though his mind screamed for him to stop. The whispers still clung to him, growing louder, a constant murmur in the back of his mind. "It's too late now. You've crossed the threshold. You can't go back." With every step, the glow grew brighter, revealing itself to be the dim light of a lamp. As Ethan neared it, the eerie quiet of the place intensified. The air was thick with the weight of it, the oppressive silence pressing against him. He looked around, and that's when he realized that he wasn't alone. In the distance, there were figures, shapes, half-formed, blurry as if viewed through a fog. Some stood still, Others moved slowly. They were indistinct, faceless, just like the woman on the train. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine as they all seemed to turn toward him in unison, their heads snapping in his direction. He froze. His heart skipped a beat. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment he wondered if he were still dreaming. Or was he awake? Was this real? The figures didn't speak. They didn't need to. The cold, hollow eyes that stared at him were enough. He could feel their eyes digging into him, reaching deep into his soul, tearing at the very fabric of his reality. His feet moved once more, driven by fear or some unseen force, but his mind was consumed by questions. What was happening? Why was he here? The questions swirled in his head, the weight of them unbearable. There were no answers. Only the suffocating presence of the figures, the oppressive darkness, and the whispers that never stopped. As Ethan walked forward, his vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to twist and distort. The air shimmered with heat, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but it only made things worse. The once familiar sights of the station were gone, replaced with strange, unfamiliar landscapes that seemed to shift and change with each step. He felt as if he were walking through a nightmare, one that stretched endlessly, a never-ending cycle of confusion. In front of him, the glow brightened, revealing a door. But this wasn't any ordinary door. It looked ancient, weathered, as though it had been here far longer than anything around it. The edges of the doorframe were cracked and rotting, yet the door itself stood firm, unyielding. There was something about it, something that called to him. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. As he touched it, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He could hear them now, not just in his mind, but in the air around him, swirling like a storm. You can't open it. You're not ready. The door is only for those who know what it means. A sudden flash of memories hit him, his childhood, his family, faces he thought he had forgotten. The memories were fleeting, broken, like shattered glass. Each time he tried to piece them together, they slipped away like smoke. The more he reached for them, the more they dissolved, leaving only a hollow emptiness in their wake. What am I doing here? Ethan muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. He looked down at his hand, still gripping the doorknob, but his fingers were no longer his own. The skin was pale, almost translucent, the veins beneath it dark and twisted. It was as if his hand had aged years in a matter of moments. A sharp, sudden pain shot through his chest, and for a brief moment he thought he might collapse. The figures around him began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, their heads turning sharply in unison, following his every move. Their eyes glowed now, an eerie, unnatural light flickering in their depths. Ethan could feel their eyes upon him, digging deep into his mind, into his soul. He could feel the weight of them, pressing on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. But there was nowhere to run. The door creaked open on its own, but with groaning in protest as though it were alive. The room on the other side was dark, but as Ethan stepped through, a cold wind brushed past him, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten, something decayed. He stepped cautiously into the darkness, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the hollow silence. The room was large, much larger than it should have been, stretching out before him with no visible walls. It felt endless, like a void, as if there was nothing beyond it. In the center of the room stood a large mirror. The glass was cracked, jagged lines running through it like scars, and yet the reflection within it was unnervingly clear. Ethan's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't quite him. The figure in the mirror seemed older, wearier, as if it had lived 1,000 lives in the span of a moment. The eyes that stared back at him were wide with terror, filled with a fear Ethan couldn't place. He wanted to look away, but something held him there, something in the reflection, pulling him in deeper. In the reflection, the figure reached out to touch the glass, and Ethan's hand moved of its own accord, mirroring the movement. As his fingers brushed the cracked surface, he felt a jolt of electricity, a sudden rush of sensation that made his skin tingle. Then the figure in the mirror smiled. It was not a comforting smile. It was a twisted, knowing grin, the kind of smile you give when you know someone's deepest secret, the kind of smile that knows your fate before you do. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the reflection spoke, its voice barely more than a whisper, but so close, so real. You never left. You were always here. The words echoed in his mind, their meaning sinking in slowly, like a weight he couldn't escape. The truth was too much for him to process, too much for him to comprehend. And then, the reflection's smile faded, replaced by an expression of absolute horror. The figure in the mirror opened its mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Ethan felt his body stiffen, his limbs growing heavy. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around him like chains. The figures outside the room, the ones who had been watching him, now moved toward the mirror, their eyes fixed on the reflection. They reached out, their hands trembling, as if drawn to something deep within it. In that moment, Ethan realized what was happening. The reflection was no longer just a mirror, it was a gateway. A doorway that connected this world to something else, something that lay beyond the boundaries of reality. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a trap, and Ethan was the one who had been lured into it. The whispers became louder, rising in a crescendo of madness, until Ethan couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The figures around him began to move faster, their faces contorted in rage, in hunger. The door had opened, but it wasn't a path to salvation. It was a path to something far worse. Ethan tried to turn and run, but it was too late. The darkness had already claimed him, and the whispers echoed in his mind. Ethan stumbled into the dark void beyond the train doors, his feet seemingly moving of their own accord. As the cold air wrapped around him, he realized the train car had disappeared entirely. There was no platform, no ground, no sign of where he had been. The darkness around him was all-encompassing, swallowing every trace of light. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow and erratic. Where was he? What was this place? A faint glow appeared ahead of him, flickering like a distant star. He felt himself drawn toward it, instinctively taking one step after another, though his mind screamed for him to stop. The whispers still clung to him, growing louder, a constant murmur in the back of his mind. It's too late now. You've crossed the threshold. You can't go back. With every step, the glow grew brighter, revealing itself to be the dim light of a lamp. As Ethan neared it, the eerie quiet of the place intensified. The air was thick with the weight of it, the oppressive silence pressing against him. He looked around, and that's when he realized that he wasn't alone. In the distance, there were figures, shapes, half-formed, blurry as if viewed through a fog. Some stood still, others moved slowly. They were indistinct, faceless, just like the woman on the train. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine as they all seemed to turn toward him in unison, their heads snapping in his direction. He froze. His heart skipped a beat. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment he wondered if he were still dreaming. Or was he awake? Was this real? The figures didn't speak. They didn't need to. The cold, hollow eyes that stared at him were enough. He could feel their eyes digging into him, reaching deep into his soul, tearing at the very fabric of his reality. His feet moved once more, driven by fear or some unseen force, but his mind was consumed by questions. What was happening? Why was he here? The questions swirled in his head, the weight of them unbearable. There were no answers. Only the suffocating presence of the figures, the oppressive darkness, and the whispers that never stopped. As Ethan walked forward, his vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to twist and distort. The air shimmered with heat, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but it only made things worse. The once familiar sights of the station were gone, replaced with strange, unfamiliar landscapes that seemed to shift and change with each step. He felt as if he were walking through a nightmare, one that stretched endlessly, a never-ending cycle of confusion. In front of him, the glow brightened, revealing a door. But this wasn't any ordinary door. It looked ancient, weathered, as though it had been here far longer than anything around it. The edges of the doorframe were cracked and rotting, yet the door itself stood firm, unyielding. There was something about it, something that called to him. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. As he touched it, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He could hear them now, not just in his mind, but in the air around him, swirling like a storm. You can't open it. You're not ready. The door is only for those who know what it means. A sudden flash of memories hit him, his childhood, his family, faces he thought he had forgotten. The memories were fleeting, broken, like shattered glass. Each time he tried to piece them together, they slipped away like smoke. The more he reached for them, the more they dissolved, leaving only a hollow emptiness in their wake. What am I doing here? Ethan muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. He looked down at his hand, still gripping the doorknob, but his fingers were no longer his own. The skin was pale, almost translucent, the veins beneath it dark and twisted. It was as if his hand had aged years in a matter of moments. A sharp, sudden pain shot through his chest, and for a brief moment he thought he might collapse. The figures around him began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, their heads turning sharply in unison, following his every move. Their eyes glowed now, an eerie, unnatural light flickering in their depths. Ethan could feel their eyes upon him, digging deep into his mind, into his soul. He could feel the weight of them, pressing on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. But there was nowhere to run. The door creaked open on its own, the wood groaning in protest as though it were alive. The room on the other side was dark, but as Ethan stepped through, a cold wind brushed past him, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten, something decayed. He stepped cautiously into the darkness, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the hollow silence. The room was large, much larger than it should have been, stretching out before him with no visible walls. It felt endless, like a void, as if there was nothing beyond it. In the center of the room stood a large mirror. The glass was cracked, jagged lines running through it like scars, and yet the reflection within it was unnervingly clear. Ethan's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't quite him. The figure in the mirror seemed older, wearier, as if it had lived 1,000 lives in the span of a moment. The eyes that stared back at him were wide with terror, filled with a fear Ethan couldn't place. He wanted to look away, but something held him there, something in the reflection, pulling him in deeper. In the reflection, the figure reached out to touch the glass, and Ethan's hand moved of its own accord, mirroring the movement. As his fingers brushed the cracked surface, he felt a jolt of electricity, a sudden rush of sensation that made his skin tingle. Then the figure in the mirror smiled. It was not a comforting smile. It was a twisted, knowing grin, the kind of smile you give when you know someone's deepest secret, the kind of smile that knows your fate before you do. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the reflection spoke, its voice barely more than a whisper, but so close, so real. You never left. You were always here. The words echoed in his mind, their meaning sinking in slowly, like a weight he couldn't escape. The truth was too much for him to process, too much for him to comprehend. And then, the reflection's smile faded, replaced by an expression of absolute horror. The figure in the mirror opened its mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Ethan felt his body stiffen, his limbs growing heavy. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around him like chains. The figures outside the room, the ones who had been watching him, now moved toward the mirror, their eyes fixed on the reflection. They reached out, their hands trembling, as if drawn to something deep within it. In that moment, Ethan realized what was happening. The reflection was no longer just a mirror, it was a gateway. A doorway that connected this world to something else, something that lay beyond the boundaries of reality. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a trap, and Ethan was the one who had been lured into it. The whispers became louder, rising in a crescendo of madness, until Ethan couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The figures around him began to move faster, their faces contorted in rage, in hunger. The door had opened, but it wasn't a path to salvation. It was a path to something far worse. Ethan tried to turn and run, but it was too late. The darkness had already claimed him, and the whispers echoed in his mind.